had this idea to take her out to Wilson Farm. It wasn't much of a farm anymore, more like a bunch of overgrown fields and woods way out Cooks Hill Road. But I remembered hearing stories, whispers really, about an old cemetery back in the woods there. Abandoned, spooky, perfect for teenagers trying to impress each other, right? Especially around Halloween time. So I convinced Sarah. She was a little hesitant, I remember that. Said it sounded creepy. But I played it up like it was going to be fun, an adventure, and finally she said okay. Looking back, I really wish I'd just taken her to the movies. We drove out in my old pickup, the one my dad helped me fix up. Cooks Hill Road was pitch black out there, even back then before all the houses started popping up. Just trees and shadows. Felt like we were driving into nowhere. Finally, I spotted the place where I thought we needed to park. It wasn't a marked entrance or anything, just a pull-off near one of those old oil pump jacks. You know, the kind that just slowly nod up and down. Rusty metal and the smell of oil and dirt. It felt isolated, even before we got out of the truck. We got out, and the air was cold, that crisp fall air that smells like leaves burning and the ground getting ready for winter. Moon was almost full, bright enough that we didn't need flashlights, which of course I hadn't even thought to bring. Stupid kid. The woods were right there, starting at the edge of the field. There was a trail leading in, looked like maybe an old logging path or something. We started walking. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that's almost deafening when you're used to town noise. Just the crunch of leaves under our boots and the wind rustling in the trees way above. After a few minutes, the trail dipped down, and I knew we were getting close to the creek. I used to fish in that creek when I was a kid, before Wilson Farm got all grown over. We came to a clearing, just like I remembered, opening up around a little pond. The moonlight was hitting the water, making it shine like silver. It was actually kinda pretty, peaceful. For a minute, it felt like we were alone in the middle of nowhere, just the two of us and nature doing its thing. Frogs were going crazy by the pond, that deep croaking sound they make, filling the air. It was actually kind of loud, a constant background noise. We were walking around the edge of the clearing, heading deeper into the woods where I thought the cemetery was, and then, suddenly, it stopped, just like that. Silence. The frogs just cut out, dead quiet, like someone had flipped a switch. It was so sudden it made my ears ring. We both stopped walking, just stood there looking at each other. Sarah squeezed my hand a little tighter. Then we heard it. It was a thud. A heavy, dull thud sound, like something big and soft hitting the ground. It sounded like it was close, maybe just off the trail to our right. We both jumped, whipped our heads around, trying to see through the trees. Nothing. Just shadows and moonlight patches on the ground. We were looking up too, thinking maybe a branch fell or something, but there wasn't a breeze. The trees were still as statues. We stood there for a second, holding our breath, listening. Nothing but the wind whispering in the very top branches of the trees, way up high. Probably just a deer or something, I told myself, trying to sound braver than I felt. Then it happened again. Another thud. Closer this time, definitely closer, and louder. Like something heavier fell. But again, we couldn't see anything. The woods were just there, silent and watching. The hair on the back of my neck started to prickle. That feeling, you know, like you're being watched, even though you can't see anyone. Sarah whispered, "What was that?" Her voice was shaky. I tried to play it cool, shrug it off. "I don't know, maybe an animal." But I didn't believe it. Animals in the woods don't make sounds like that, not unless it's something really big. And even then, it just didn't feel right. It felt heavy, deliberate, if that makes any sense. Maybe we should just go back," Sarah said, still whispering. She was definitely scared now. I could feel it in her hand. She was pulling back a little, wanting to turn around. Honestly, I was starting to get freaked out too. The whole mood had shifted. The peaceful, kinda cool, spooky vibe was gone. Now it just felt wrong. like we were intruding on something we shouldn't be. "Yeah," I said, finally giving in. "Yeah, let's head back." I turned around, and Sarah practically spun around after me. We started walking back the way we came, trying to act casual, like we weren't hurrying. But we were. Our pace definitely picked up. We were walking back down the trail, towards the clearing with the pond. The woods still felt silent and empty, except for the sound of our own feet crunching on the leaves. And then I heard it again, just barely audible at first, but definitely there. Footsteps, walking in the leaves, just like us, but not our footsteps. These were different, heavier somehow, and they weren't right behind us. They were off to the side, maybe 5-10 yards into the woods to our left, to the north of the trail. I glanced over my shoulder without stopping, trying to catch a glimpse of something, anything, just trees, dark tree trunks and shadows, patches of moonlight. Nothing moving, but the footsteps kept going. Crunch, crunch, crunch on the dry leaves, keeping pace with us, exactly keeping pace. Every step we took, it took a step. When we sped up, the footsteps sped up too. It was like something was walking with us, or following us, but staying hidden in the trees. I stopped walking suddenly. Sarah stumbled a little, almost tripped over my heels. "What?" she whispered, looking around, her eyes wide in the moonlight. We stood there, silent. Our breathing seemed loud in the quiet woods. And then the footsteps stopped too, right after we stopped. Just silence again, except for our own breathing and the blood pounding in my ears. I swallowed hard, trying to wet my dry throat. This wasn't a deer. Deer don't stop walking when you stop. And deer don't walk exactly in time with your own steps. This was intentional. We started walking again, slowly this time, and the footsteps started again too, right away. Crunch, 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 keeping pace with us. Off in the trees to our left, like it was mirroring us. Fear. That's when the real fear hit me. Not just spooked or creeped out. Real, cold, heart-hammering fear. I didn't know what was out there, but I knew it wasn't good. It wasn't normal. This wasn't just some animal. This was something else. I grabbed Sarah's hand tighter, and we started walking faster, almost jogging, and the footsteps sped up too, still keeping pace, still in the woods to the left. Whatever it was keeping up with us, no problem. It was playing with us. That was the feeling I got, like it was enjoying scaring us. Panic started to set in. I could feel Sarah shaking beside me. We were practically running now, pounding down the trail, leaves flying up around our boots. And the footsteps were still there, crunch, 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 just as fast as us, relentless, unstopping. We burst out of the woods, back into the clearing with the pond. I was hoping maybe being in the open would make it stop, make it go away. But the footsteps kept going. We could still hear them, crunching through the undergrowth just inside the tree line, on the edge of the clearing, still following. I stopped again, breathing hard, chest heaving. Sarah was gasping for air too, her face pale in the moonlight, tears starting to well up in her eyes. I had to do something. I couldn't just keep running. I felt like if we ran all the way back to the truck, whatever it was would just keep following us. It was like it was toying with us. Taking a deep breath, trying to steady my voice, I yelled into the darkness, yelled at the trees, at whatever was out there. "Who's there?" My voice cracked, sounded weak and pathetic even to my own ears. It echoed in the quiet clearing, then died away. Silence. For a second, there was just silence again. I held my breath, listening, waiting, hoping, maybe hoping it was gone, maybe it was just our imagination playing tricks on us in the dark woods. Maybe. And then it answered. Not with words, not with a voice, but with growls. Deep, guttural growls. Low down in the throat like an animal, but not like any animal I'd ever heard. Darker, heavier, more menacing. 3 of them, one after another. Grr, grr, grr. They rumbled through the night air, sending chills down my spine, making the hairs on my arms stand straight up. It wasn't a dog. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything I could even imagine. It sounded ancient, primeval. Something from a nightmare, something that shouldn't be real. That was it. That was the breaking point. All the fear and tension, it just snapped. Panic took over completely. I didn't think anymore, I just reacted. I grabbed Sarah's hand and we ran like hell, across the clearing, back to the trail, back towards the truck. I didn't look back. I didn't care about the footsteps anymore. I just ran. I could feel Sarah stumbling beside me, but I didn't let go of her hand. I just dragged her along, fueled by pure, raw terror. We ran through the woods, branches whipping at our faces, stumbling over roots, not even looking where we were going. Just running, running, running. Until finally, we burst out of the trees, back into the field where the truck was parked. I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking so bad I could barely get them in the lock. Got the door open, shoved Sarah inside, scrambled in after her, slammed the door shut. Locked it, locked all the doors. Started the engine, my hands still shaking so much I almost stalled it. Gunned the engine, threw it in reverse, and backed out of that dirt pull-off as fast as I could, tires spitting gravel. We didn't say a word the whole drive back to town, just sat there breathing hard, staring straight ahead. Sarah was crying silently. I felt like I was going to throw up. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something back there, following us down the road, its eyes glowing in the dark. But there was nothing. Just the empty black road behind us. We got back to town, back to the lights and houses and people, and it felt like coming back to life. I dropped Sarah off at her house, didn't even go in, just mumbled goodnight and drove home. I couldn't wait to get back to my house, back to my bed, back to something that felt normal, safe. I never told anyone about it for a long time. I was too embarrassed, I guess. It sounded crazy, even to me. Footsteps in the woods, growls in the dark. It was like something out of a bad horror movie. Who would believe me? And honestly, a part of me was still trying to convince myself that it was all just my imagination. Nerves getting the best of me, the woods playing tricks in the moonlight. But I know what we heard. I know what we felt. That fear, that cold, primal terror, that wasn't in my head. And Sarah was just as scared as I was. She never wanted to go back out to Wilson Farm, not ever. We didn't talk about it much, but I know she remembered it too. It was real. To this day, I still can't explain it. What was it? What was following us in the woods that night? What made those growling sounds? I have no idea, and honestly I don't want to know. Some things are better left in the dark. Some questions are better left unanswered. I still drive down Cooks Hill Road sometimes, but I never go near Wilson Farm. Never again. The woods are still there, silent and dark, watching, and every time I drive past, I get a shiver down my spine, remembering those footsteps, those growls, remembering the terror of that night out in the middle of nowhere with something unseen, something unknown, hunting us in the dark. And that feeling stays with you. It really does. Story 2. Listen, I don't even know where to start with this, or if anyone's going to believe me, but I gotta tell someone. It's been eating me up inside for years, and just talking about it, even to strangers online, feels, I don't know, maybe like lifting a little bit of the weight. This happened back in the mid-80s. Around 86 is when it really kicked off. We were living out in Portage County, Ohio. Trailer, nothing fancy. My dad worked at the factory in Ravenna, and we were kind of close to that whole Ravenna arsenal area. Big, fenced-off military zone. Always felt a little weird living so close to something like that, but it was home. It started slow, subtle at first. Sounds mostly. Heavy sounds like someone was walking around outside at night, but not just walking, pacing. Real heavy steps, like something big and clumsy or powerful, like weights were being dropped right outside the trailer. You'd be lying in bed half asleep and you'd hear thump, 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 against the ground. The whole trailer would kind of vibrate with it. We just figured it was deer at first. Ohio's got deer all over, right? But deer don't walk like that. Deer don't sound like they weigh a ton. And deer don't smell. Because that's the next thing that started this smell. God, I can't even describe it. Nauseating is the closest I can get. Like something rotten and musky. Like something died and was left out in the sun to just stew. It'd waft in through the vents, make your stomach turn. You'd wake up in the middle of the night and it'd be thick in the air, make you gag a little. We'd check around outside in the mornings, look for a dead animal, anything but nothing, never found a damn thing. Then it started getting closer to the trailer. The footsteps got louder, heavier, and they started hitting the walls. Not like someone banging on the wall, but like something big leaning against it, then shifting its weight, and the whole metal siding of the trailer would creak and groan. We'd jump out of bed, heart pounding in your chest, grab a flashlight, look out the windows. Nothing, just darkness and the woods all around us. My dad started getting jumpy, always had a shotgun anyway for hunting, but he started keeping it loaded by the bed. Said it was just in case of trouble, didn't say what kind of trouble. My mom, she was scared, no doubt about it. She'd say it was just animals, coyotes, maybe even a bear wandered out of the woods. But even she didn't sound like she believed it, because deep down, we all knew this wasn't normal animal sounds. It went on like this for months. The pacing, the smell, the wall bumping, always at night. We got to where we barely slept. Every little creak of the trailer, every rustle in the leaves outside made you tense up. You were always listening, always waiting for the next thump, the next wave of that stink. One night, it was bad, real bad. The footsteps were constant, circling the trailer. Then the thumping on the walls started again, harder than ever. It felt like the whole trailer was going to shake off its blocks. My dad finally snapped. He grabbed his shotgun and yelled, "All right, whatever the hell you are, come on out." He threw open the trailer door and shined the porch light out into the yard. Nothing. Just black woods staring back at us. He stepped out, shotgun raised, scanned around. Still nothing. He went around the trailer, me right behind him with a flashlight, Mom peeking out the door, scared to death. We checked all around, under the trailer, everywhere, nothing. But as soon as we went back inside and turned off the porch light, thump, thump, thump started up again, right outside the bedroom wall. That's when we decided to set up those floodlights. My dad borrowed a couple from work, the big clamp-on kind, wired them up to a generator we had. He aimed one at the side of the trailer where it always seemed to be, the other at the backwoods. We waited till dark, lights off inside the trailer, just sitting there in the dark, tense as hell. And then it started. The heavy footsteps, circling, getting closer. Then, thump, against the wall. My dad flicked the switch for the floodlights. Bright white light flooded the yard. And there it was. Jesus Christ, I'll never forget it as long as I live. Standing right next to the trailer, in the floodlight beam, was... I don't know what the hell it was. Monster is the only word that even comes close. It was huge, tall, tall. Taller than the trailer roofline, got to be at least 10 feet, maybe more. Dark brown, almost black in the shadows. Covered in fur or hair, something thick and matted. It was built, I don't know, like a man, but not. Shoulders were massive, like a linebacker, and long arms hanging down, almost to the ground. But the legs, they were thick and powerful, looked bowed almost, like they were built for pushing, for moving through the woods. And the smell, God, the smell was 100 times worse in the open, just slammed into you like a wall. Its head was indistinct. It was kind of hunched over, the head pulled down into its shoulders. I couldn't make out much detail in the face, just darkness, shadow under that brow. But I saw eyes. 2 eyes, glowing kind of yellow in the light, staring right at us through the trailer window. Just staring. No expression, no nothing, just there, watching. We were frozen, stuck like statues, just staring back. It felt like time stopped. Then it moved. Slowly, it turned its head, like it was acknowledging us, and started to walk. Not away, not yet. It started walking along the side of the trailer towards the door, towards us. My dad, he finally moved. He yelled, something I couldn't even hear over the blood rushing in my ears, and he charged out the door, shotgun raised. He yelled again, fired a shot in the air, trying to scare it, I guess. The thing didn't even flinch, just kept walking. My dad was between it and the trailer now. He fired again, this time pointing right at it. Buckshot, he was using buckshot meant for deer, for killing deer. He fired again and again, emptied the whole shotgun, 7 rounds, right into this thing. I saw the flashes, heard the deafening boom, 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 saw the buckshot hit it, saw puffs of fur or hair fly off in the floodlight. But the thing, it didn't even stagger, didn't grunt, didn't howl, didn't nothing. Just kept walking, like he was shooting it with BB guns. My dad was backing up now, still pointing the empty shotgun, eyes wide, face white as a ghost. The thing just kept coming. It was slow, deliberate, but it was coming right at him. He tripped backwards over something in the yard, fell on his ass, dropped the shotgun. I finally snapped out of it. I ran out, grabbed the shotgun, fumbled trying to reload, fingers all shaken. My dad was scrambling backwards, trying to get to the trailer door, screaming at me to shoot it. I couldn't reload fast enough. The thing was almost on him. Then, something came over me. Just pure, blind panic. I dropped the shotgun again, turned, and ran back into the trailer, slammed the door, locked it, bolted it. Mum was crying, huddled in the corner, shaking. We didn't stop until we were miles away, back in town, under streetlights, with people around. We drove to Ryan's place, parked in his driveway, and just sat there in the car for a long time, breathing hard, shaking. Neither of us said anything for a good 10 minutes, just sat there in the silence of the car, trying to process whatever the hell had just happened. Finally, Ryan spoke, his voice still shaky. What was that, Sean? He didn't need to explain what he meant. We both knew. We both heard it, felt it. I shook my head. Honestly, I had no idea. I don't know, man. I just don't know. And I really didn't. My mind was a blank, filled with just the echoing sounds, the heavy thuds, that terrifying growl. We eventually went inside Ryan's place. We were still wired, adrenaline still coursing through us. We made coffee, black, strong coffee, and just sat at his kitchen table, staring at each other, trying to make sense of it, trying to find some rational explanation for what we'd experienced. But there wasn't one. No logical explanation for those sounds, for that feeling of dread, that primal terror. Then, hours later, when we'd finally started to calm down a little, the thought hit me. The camera, the thermal imager. We'd set it up in Area 61, remember? Before all hell broke loose. We were supposed to check it on the way out, see if it had captured anything, but we'd completely forgotten about it in the panic of the escape. We looked at each other, and we both knew what we had to do. Stupid, maybe. Insane, probably. But we had to go back. Not back into the woods, not that night. But back to the parking lot, back to the edge of the park, just to retrieve the camera. Maybe, just maybe, it had recorded something. It was early morning by the time we went back, just as the sun was starting to peek over the horizon, casting long shadows across everything. The park looked different in the daylight, less menacing, more normal, beautiful even in that cold autumn light. But still, there was a lingering feeling of unease, a sense that something was still watching. We drove back to the parking lot, parked again, and walked quickly to the edge of the woods. We didn't go far in, just to where we'd set up the camera, and there it was, still strapped to the tree, blinking its little red light. Miraculously, it hadn't been disturbed. We grabbed it, unstrapped it, and got the hell out of there again, fast. Back at Ryan's, we hooked the camera up to his computer, heart pounding again. We downloaded the files, scanned through the video. Mostly just trees swaying in the faint breeze, the ground. Nothing much. Then we found it. The thermal image recording, from the time everything went crazy. The image was grainy, blurry, indistinct. Thermal imaging, especially in the woods, isn't exactly HD video. But there they were. 2 figures. Tall figures. Bipedal. Definitely walking on 2 legs. Moving through the trees. Heated bodies against the cold background of the woods. And they were big. Way bigger than people. Taller than any man I'd ever seen. One of the figures was clearly larger than the other, and the larger one, it was carrying something or someone. A smaller shape draped over its shoulder, limp, lifeless maybe. It was hard to tell from the blurry thermal image, but the shape was definitely smaller than the 2 large figures, child-sized almost. We stared at the image, frozen, the scream, the whooping, the thuds, the growl. And now this, figures in the woods, tall, unknown figures, one of them carrying what looked like a child. It all clicked into place in a way that made our blood run cold all over again. We haven't gone back to Shadow Valley since. Haven't even talked about it much to anyone. People wouldn't believe us anyway. They'd think we were crazy or lying or just playing a prank, but we know what we heard. We know what we felt. And we saw something. Something we can't explain. Something that's out there in those woods, still, watching, waiting. Sometimes late at night I still hear those sounds in my head. The scream, the whooping, that growl. And I see that thermal image, those 2 tall figures moving through the darkness, one of them carrying something small and limp. And I shiver, and I wonder, what was it? What did we stumble into out there in Area 61? And what was that thing carrying? I don't have any answers, and honestly I don't think I want them anymore. Some things are better left unknown, some doors are better left closed, and some parts of the woods are just best left alone. I was breathing like I'd run a marathon, heart beating out of my chest. We could hear my dad pounding on the door, screaming to let him in. I couldn't move, couldn't think. I just stood there, staring at the door, waiting for it to break down. He got back inside somehow. I don't even remember opening the door, just remember him stumbling in, slamming the door shut again, breathing hard, white as a sheet. He leaned against the door, looking out the window next to it. "It's gone," he gasped. "Just gone." We didn't sleep at all that night. Just sat there huddled together, listening, waiting. Every shadow, every sound, we jumped. But it didn't come back that night. Next day, daylight, everything looked different. Ridiculous almost, like it had all been a bad dream. We went outside, looked around. No sign of nothing. Just the woods, the trailer, the floodlights still set up, the shotgun lying in the yard where I dropped it. No tracks, nothing. Except that smell, still hanging heavy in the air, that rotten, musky stink. We told some neighbors what happened. They looked at us like we were crazy. "Bigfoot," one of them laughed. "You saw Bigfoot, huh?" They didn't believe a word of it. Until, a few days later, one of our neighbors, Old Man Henderson, he lived down the road, he came rushing over in his pickup, looking scared shitless. Said he saw something last night. Peeking in his bedroom window, he woke up, something felt wrong, looked over, and there it was, outside his window, staring in. He said it was tall and dark, couldn't see its face clearly, but he saw the eyes glowing in the dark, sounded just like what we saw. Then another neighbor, younger guy, name of Dave, he said he saw something too. Out in the woods behind his place, big dark shape moving through the trees. He jumped on his four-wheeler, grabbed his .44 Magnum pistol, chased after it. Said he actually got close enough to take a shot at it, unloaded the whole .44 at it. Said it was like hitting a brick wall, didn't even slow it down. And that same night, it came back to our trailer, thumping on the walls again, just like nothing happened. That's when the real fear set in. It wasn't just us anymore. Other people were seeing it, and shooting it didn't do nothing. What the hell were we dealing with? Then came the puppies. Our dog, Blue, she was a blue heeler, had just had a litter of puppies a few weeks before. We kept them in a box in the laundry room. One morning we woke up, the puppies were gone, just gone. Blue was frantic, whining and barking, pacing around the laundry room. The door was closed, windows shut. No way they just wandered off. We searched everywhere, called and called, nothing. Then we heard it from the woods, faint, high-pitched yelps, puppy whimpers. And then silence. Just silence. Like someone had just snuffed them out. Blue went crazy, trying to get out of the trailer, tearing at the door. We knew what had taken them. My dad went to the forest ranger, told him what was going on, about the creature, the puppies, everything. The ranger just laughed. "Sounds like you folks been drinking too much moonshine," he said. "There ain't no monsters out there. Probably just coyotes got your pups. You're just working yourselves up over nothing. Just craziness." Dismissed us like we were nuts. My stepdad, he was skeptical too. Always had a rational explanation for everything. Said we were imagining things, exaggerating. Probably just deer, like we originally thought. He came out to visit a few weeks later. He stayed with us for a couple days, didn't see or hear anything. He was starting to get smug, saying, "See? Told ya." Then, one afternoon, he went out for a walk in the woods behind the trailer, just to clear his head, he said. He came back an hour later, white, shaking, couldn't talk right, just kept pointing towards the woods. Finally, he got it out in broken sentences. Said he was walking along, heard something moving in the trees, looked over and saw it, just standing there watching him. Said it was huge, smelled horrible, eyes glowed in the shadows. He just froze, couldn't move. It just stared at him for a long minute, then turned and walked deeper into the woods. He turned around and ran all the way back to the trailer, didn't stop until he was inside. From that day on, my stepdad, Mr. Skeptic himself, he started carrying a gun. Everywhere he went. Said he didn't believe in monsters, but he wasn't taking any chances. The weirdest part, the part that still freaks me out the most, was my niece. Charlie's daughter, little girl, 7 years old, name of Emily. She used to come visit, play out in the woods behind the trailer. One time she came running back, all excited. Said she was playing with hairy kids in the woods. We asked her what she meant. Hairy kids. She said, yeah, hairy kids. They were playing tag and hide and seek. Just kids, but hairy. We figured she was just making up imaginary friends. Kids do that, right? Then, a few days later, she came back from playing in the woods, and she smelled like it, that same nauseating, rotten smell, strong. We asked her where she'd been, who she'd been playing with. She said, "With the hairy kids, Daddy." We told her not to go back in the woods by herself. It wasn't safe. But kids, you know. Next time she came over, she went back to the woods. Came back later that afternoon, smelling even worse than before. This time, we really grilled her. "Emily, who are these hairy kids?" She just giggled. "They're the hairy kids. They live in the woods." Then she said, "The hairy daddy carried me." "Carried you where?" My sister, Charlie's wife, asked, getting worried now. "Over the swamp," Emily said. "He carried me over the swamp to the island to play with the puppies. Then he carried me back." Swamp? Island? There was a swampy area deep in the woods. Never really thought of it as a swamp. More like just wet woods. And maybe a little raised area in the middle. Not really an island. Puppies? What puppies? She just meant animals. Baby animals, we figured. We asked her more, tried to get her to explain, but she just kept talking about the hairy daddy and the hairy kids and playing with the puppies on the island. She wasn't scared at all. To her, it was just normal. Playing with friends, like this monstrous thing was just another dad in the woods, looking after his hairy kids and their puppies. It was the most messed up thing. A 7-year-old girl hanging out with this creature and its family in the middle of the woods over a swamp, and she thought it was just a play date. Completely unfazed by something that was terrorizing everyone else, that had scared grown men into carrying guns. After that, they started clear-cutting some of the woods around us. Big logging operation, came in with the machines, chopped down a whole section. After that, the activity lessened. The pacing around the trailer stopped. The wall thumping mostly stopped. The smell wasn't as strong, wasn't as constant. It was like, without the thick woods right up against the trailer, it retreated. But it didn't go away completely. Even after the clear-cutting, we still heard things in the woods. Heavy footsteps, further off now, deeper in the trees. And sometimes late at night, when the wind was right, we'd still catch a whiff of that smell, that putrid, sickening stench. And every now and then, we'd hear it. A howl, not like a coyote howl, not like a dog howl, deeper, louder, more guttural, a long, drawn-out, mournful howl that would send shivers down your spine. It's been years since we lived in that trailer, years since we saw it, years since we heard it pounding on the walls. We moved away, tried to forget about it, but I haven't. I can't. Sometimes late at night I still wake up smelling that smell, hearing those heavy steps in my head, and I wonder, is it still out there? In those woods in Portage County? Waiting in the shadows? And what the hell was it? What the hell did we see? I got no answers, just questions and fear, always fear, and the image of those yellow eyes staring back at me from the darkness. That's something you don't just forget. Ever. Story 3. Okay, so I don't usually do this kind of thing, posting online, but honestly, I've been thinking about this lately and it just keeps coming back to me. Maybe putting it out there somewhere, even just to strangers online, will help me. I don't know, make sense of it maybe. Or maybe just know I'm not completely nuts. It happened a long time ago now. Summer of 2003. Me and Ilara, we were young and restless, always looking for the next adventure, the next way to make some cash and see something new. We weren't afraid of getting our hands dirty. That's why we ended up in Silent Creek, Washington. It's really out there. Rural doesn't even begin to cover it. Think deep woods, tiny town, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone else, and outsiders stand out like sore thumbs. We took a job as night watchman at a lumber mill. Temporary gig, just for the summer months. Sounded easy enough, basically just making sure nobody broke in, no equipment went missing, that sort of thing. They gave us this old trailer to stay in, right on the edge of the logging site. Nothing fancy, but it was home for the summer, and the pay was decent, enough to fund our next big trip, whatever that might be. The first few weeks were normal, I guess. Boring, mostly. Nights were quiet, the forest around us was dense and dark. We'd do our rounds, check the fences, the machinery, make sure everything was locked up tight. Then we'd just hang out in the trailer, read, play cards, wait for the sun to come up. Days were usually pretty hot, those dry summer days you get in the Pacific Northwest. We spent a lot of time exploring, hiking around, trying to find ways to kill the daylight hours. There was this lake not too far from the trailer, according to the maps the foreman had shown us. He'd even mentioned it was good for fishing. So, towards the end of July, after we'd been there for a while, and were kind of settling into the routine, we decided to check it out. A day off, some peace and quiet, maybe catch some dinner. Seemed like a perfect way to spend an afternoon. We packed a couple of fishing rods, some snacks, water, the usual stuff. It wasn't a long hike to the lake, maybe half an hour through the woods. The trail was overgrown in places, but easy enough to follow. The air was thick with that pine smell, that really earthy, damp smell that you get deep in the forest, even when it's dry. The kind of smell that gets in your clothes and sticks with you. When we got to the lake, it was beautiful, in a wild, untouched kind of way. Smaller than I expected, really more like a big pond, maybe. Surrounded by trees that came right down to the water's edge. The water was dark and still, reflecting the trees like a mirror. No sounds except for the buzzing of insects and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. Exactly what we were looking for, peaceful and quiet. We found a good spot on a fallen log near the edge of the water and started setting up our lines. The sun was starting to dip a little, that golden hour light filtering through the trees. It felt good to just sit there, relax, breathe in the fresh air. We didn't talk much, just enjoyed the quiet. Ilara was always good at that, just being present in the moment. Me, I'm always a bit more wired, but even I started to unwind. We'd been fishing for maybe an hour, no bites yet, but honestly, we weren't really focused on catching anything. It was more about just being there. Then it happened. The sound. It just ripped through the quiet. Like something huge and angry and hurt all at once. It was a scream, but not like any animal scream I'd ever heard before. Deeper, way deeper than anything I'd expect from a bear or a cougar, more guttural and thick. Thick is the only word I can think of, like it had weight to it, like it was solid in the air. It came from the woods on the far side of the lake, across from where we were sitting. A short, sharp, bark-like scream. Then silence. We both froze, rods in our hands, staring at each other. My heart started hammering in my chest. What was that? Ilara whispered, her eyes wide. She was usually the calm one, the collected one, but I could see she was shaken too. I don't know, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Didn't sound like anything I know. We waited, listening, holding our breath. Nothing. Just the insects buzzing, the wind in the trees. Maybe it was just some weird bird, I thought, trying to rationalize it. Maybe a deer in distress, but it didn't sound right for either of those. Then it came again. This time, it was from the opposite side of the lake, behind us, further back in the woods. Another scream, almost exactly the same as the first, but further away, muffled by the trees, like an answer or a response to the first one, but more sinister. It echoed out there, even though it was further. It hung in the air for longer. My blood went cold. It wasn't just that the sound was strange, it was the placement of it. The way it seemed to come from two different directions, almost at the same time, like it was surrounding us. Ilara and I exchanged a look. The kind of look that says, okay, something's not right here. We were both experienced with being outdoors. We'd hiked and camped in wild places before. We knew the sounds of the woods, or we thought we did. This was different. Wrong. Let's just pack up, I said, my voice tight. Maybe we should head back. Ilara nodded quickly, grabbing her rod and starting to reel in her line, even though there was nothing on it. I did the same, my hands shaking slightly. We were moving fast now, urgency starting to take over. Something in those sounds, in the way they moved around us, it triggered something deep down, some primal alarm bell. Then the screams started again, and again, and again. This time they were closer, coming from different points around the lake. Not in a pattern, just random, chaotic, like whatever was making those sounds was moving through the trees, getting closer to us, circling, and the sounds, they were louder now, clearer. I could hear more detail in them. It wasn't just a scream, it was a growl mixed with a scream, a deep ripping sound like vocal cords being torn apart. And there was something else, something wet in the sound, like phlegm or saliva. Disgusting, terrifying. Fear, real fear, started to grip me then. Not just the nervousness of hearing something unknown in the woods. This was bone-deep fear, the kind that makes your stomach clench and your muscles tighten. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up, and then the ducks went crazy. There had been a few wild ducks swimming on the lake earlier, near the far shore. We hadn't paid them much attention. Now suddenly they exploded out of the trees on the far side of the lake. Not flying normally, not just taking off from the water. They burst from the tree line in a panicked frenzy, wings beating wildly, squawking in terror. A whole flock of them, maybe 15 or 20, all erupting at once from the exact direction where the first scream had come. They flew right over the lake, towards us, low and fast, like they were being chased. They were terrified. You could see it in their panicked flight, in their desperate flapping. They weren't just leaving the lake, they were fleeing something. That was it. That was the moment we both snapped. All thoughts of calm fishing, of peaceful afternoon by the lake, vanished. Pure, unadulterated panic took over. We didn't even look at each other. We both just knew instinctively we had to get out of there. Now. We dropped our fishing rods, not even bothering to reel in the lines properly. Just dropped them on the ground, grabbed our backpacks and turned and ran. Ran back the way we'd come, back towards the trail, back towards the trailer. The screams were still coming, closer now, definitely closer, and more frequent, like whatever was making them was closing in on us. We could hear the snapping of branches in the woods, the rustling of undergrowth, not just the wind. Something was moving in there, something big, and it was coming towards us. We were running full tilt now, adrenaline pumping. The trail was narrow and uneven, roots and rocks underfoot. I stumbled a couple of times, nearly falling, but managed to keep going. Ilara was right behind me, breathing hard. We didn't say a word, just ran, driven by pure primal fear. Then another sound, this time right above us. A flapping of wings, loud and sudden, close. I instinctively ducked, expecting another flock of panicked ducks, but then something hit me, hard. Something slammed into the side of my head, knocked me sideways. I staggered, lost my footing completely, and went down hard, sprawling on the trail. Everything went blurry for a second. Pain shot through my head, my cheek hitting the ground, scratching against the dirt and rocks. "Jasper!" I heard Ilara scream behind me. I scrambled to my feet, dazed, disoriented. What the hell just happened? I reached up and touched my head, feeling a throbbing pain on my temple, and then I saw it. Not on my head, but on the trail in front of me. A duck, a wild duck lying there on the ground, its neck twisted at a sickening angle, its eyes wide and glazed. Dead and wet, covered in blood. It wasn't just lying on the ground, it had impacted. It had hit me, not just fallen. And then I realized what must have happened. Another duck, another panicked duck, had flown out of the trees, just like the others, but this one had flown right into me. In mid-air collision, a dead duck launched from the forest, flying directly at my head, a projectile duck. The absurdity of it, the sheer bizarre horror of it, hit me in that moment. A wave of nausea washed over me. This wasn't just scary. This wasn't just unsettling. This was insane. This was something completely and utterly wrong. I didn't have time to process it. I didn't have time to think about the physics of a projectile duck or the sheer unbelievable unlikelihood of it all. The screams were closer now, so close I could almost feel them vibrating in my chest. And the rustling in the woods, the snapping of branches, it was right there, just off the trail. Whatever was making those sounds was right beside us now, moving through the trees, keeping pace with us. Ilara grabbed my arm, pulling me to my feet. "Come on, we have to go," she yelled, her face white, her eyes wide with terror. She wasn't even looking at the dead duck. She was focused only on getting away. And I didn't argue, I didn't ask questions, I didn't try to make sense of it. I just ran with Ilara, stumbling, scrambling, desperate to get back to the trailer, back to the car, back to anything that felt like safety. We ran like we were being chased by demons, because in that moment, in that terrifying, insane reality, it felt like we were. The screams were relentless, echoing all around us, from every direction. The feeling of being watched, of being hunted, was overwhelming. It was in the air, thick and heavy, suffocating. We burst out of the trees, finally, into the clearing where the trailer was parked. The logging site, with its silent machinery, suddenly seemed like a beacon of civilization, even though just hours before it had felt isolated and lonely. We ran to the trailer, fumbling with the keys, unlocking the door, slamming it shut behind us, bolting it, locking it, turning around and looking at each other, panting, gasping for breath, sweat pouring down our faces, our hearts pounding in our chests. Silence. Inside the trailer there was sudden, deafening silence, except for our ragged breathing. No screams, no rustling branches, just silence. We stood there for a moment, just listening, just trying to catch our breath, trying to calm our racing hearts. Then we moved, quickly, frantically, locking all the windows, drawing the curtains, double-checking the door, making sure we were sealed in, barricaded in, against whatever was out there. We didn't turn on the lights. We just stood there in the dimness, staring at each other, trying to process what had just happened, trying to make sense of the screams, the panicked ducks, the projectile duck. What the hell was that? Elara whispered, her voice trembling. She was shaking all over, visibly trembling. I shook my head, speechless. I don't know, I managed to get out, my voice hoarse. I have no idea. We stayed in the trailer for the rest of the day and all through the night, huddled together, listening, waiting. Every creak of the trailer, every rustle of leaves outside made us jump. We didn't sleep. We couldn't sleep. Fear had burrowed too deep. The screams didn't come back. Not that night. The forest outside was silent. But the silence was almost worse. It was a heavy, oppressive silence. A silence that felt watchful. We didn't go back to the lake. Not ever again. We finished out the summer at the lumber mill, doing our night watch rounds, but we never went near the woods again if we could help it. And every night, doing those rounds, walking through the dark logging site, I would listen. I would scan the tree line, listening for that sound, waiting for it, dreading it. We never heard it again, not in Silent Creek. We left at the end of the summer as planned, packed up the trailer and drove away. We never talked about it much afterwards. It was like some shared nightmare we both wanted to forget. We moved on, kept traveling, kept working different jobs, kept living our lives. But I never really forgot it. The sound, the fear, the feeling of being hunted, the duck. It's all still there, buried somewhere in my mind. Sometimes late at night, when it's really quiet, I think I can almost hear it again. Just a faint echo of that guttural scream coming from the darkness. And I still have no idea what it was, no explanation, no logical reason for any of it. Just the screams in the woods, and the projectile duck, and the feeling that something out there in Silent Creek was watching us, something ancient and angry and hungry, something that we were never meant to see or hear, and to this day, I still can't explain it. It just happened, and then it stopped, like it never even was. Story 4. Me and Jasper, were still working security up in Blackwood Forest. We'd had that weird thing happen at the lake a few nights before, which, honestly, I'm still trying to make sense of that myself. But whatever that was, it left us both pretty on edge. We were jumping at shadows, and every rustle in the trees sounded like a monster movie sound effect. Dumb, I know. We kept telling ourselves it was just nerves, just the dark playing tricks, but in the back of my mind, something felt wrong, deeply wrong. Anyway, after the lake, we decided we needed to check the logging equipment down in the clearing near the trailer. It was just standard procedure, part of the nightly rounds. Make sure nobody messed with the machinery, make sure everything was locked up. Totally routine. But after what we saw at the lake, routine felt like a joke. That night was a new moon. Pitch black. Seriously, the kind of dark that feels thick, like you could cut it with a knife. You step out of the trailer and it's like being swallowed whole. No stars, no moon, just blackness. The air was heavy too, still and humid, even though it was August. Everything felt damp and kind of sticky and quiet. Freakishly quiet. You know how sometimes the woods are loud with crickets and stuff? This night, nothing, just silence. A heavy, dead silence that felt way more unnerving than any noise. Jasper and I grabbed our laser pens. Yeah, just laser pens. Stupid, right? Looking back, it's almost laughable. We were armed with freaking laser pointers against whatever was out there. But honestly, at the time, it felt like something. A beam of light in all that darkness, at least we could see something. We usually carried flashlights, proper ones, but for some reason, that night we just grabbed the laser pens. Maybe it was because they were smaller, less intrusive, less like we were expecting trouble. Like we were just doing a quick check and didn't want to make a big deal of it. Denial is a powerful thing, I guess. We walked down to the clearing. It's not far from the trailer, maybe a 5-minute walk through the trees. But in that darkness, it felt like miles. Every step was hesitant, like the ground might just open up and swallow you. We kept our lasers sweeping in front of us, little red dots dancing across the undergrowth, bouncing off tree trunks. It didn't do much to light up the path, but it was something. It was like those little red dots were the only things keeping the darkness at bay. We got to the clearing and it was darker somehow. The trees surrounded it like a wall, blocking out any stray light that might have been floating around. The logging equipment hulked there in the dark. Massive shadows of metal and rubber felt cold and alien in the blackness. We started going around, lasers sweeping across the machines, checking the cabs, the wheels, everything. Just standard stuff. "Everything looks okay," Jasper muttered, his voice sounding way too loud in the silence. "Yeah," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Looks good." We were almost done checking, heading back towards the trailer side of the clearing when I saw them. Just points of red. Down low, near the ground, maybe 30 feet away, over by the edge of the woods. Just 3 pairs. 6 little red dots, glowing in the dark. My laser was moving around and it caught them, just for a split second, and then they were there. Red, burning red. I froze, dead still. My breath caught in my throat. "Jasper," I whispered, my voice cracking. "Jasper, look." I barely got the words out. He stopped walking, turned and followed my laser beam. His beam crossed mine, and for a second, both our red dots hit those eyes. They were eyes, no doubt about it. Red and glowing, like embers in the dark. Animal eyes, but not. They weren't reflecting light like deer eyes or something. They were emitting it, glowing from the inside, and they were fixed on us, just staring. The fear, man, it hit me like a physical blow. It wasn't just being scared, it was terror, the kind that freezes you solid, that makes your blood run cold. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, just stood there, laser pen shaking in my hand, those red eyes burning holes in my brain. Jasper was silent too. For what felt like forever, we just stood there, locked in this weird silent standoff with those things. The red eyes blinked slowly, deliberately, like they were observing us. And then they started to move. Not towards us, sideways. They were shifting, trying to get out of the beams of our lasers, darting from shadow to shadow, low to the ground. And for just a second, when one of my laser dots flicked across them, I saw something else. Fur. Dark, matted fur. Just a glimpse, but enough. Enough to know that these weren't just disembodied eyes. There was something there. Low to the ground, furry and with those eyes. Whatever they were hiding in the shadows, watching us. Hunting us? I don't know. But the way they were moving, slinking, avoiding the light, it felt predatory. And then it happened. One pair of eyes, one pair just lifted. Slowly, deliberately, up, up, up. From down near the ground to way too high. I'm telling you, these eyes rose up to about 6, maybe 7 feet off the ground. Just floating there in the darkness, staring down at us from above. It was impossible. Nothing in the woods stands like that. Not on 2 legs, not in the dark like that. My stomach lurched. That's when the panic really set in. I felt this cold sweat break out all over me, and my heart started hammering so hard I thought it was going to explode. 6 feet off the ground, red eyes, fur, in the middle of nowhere. No sound except the pounding of my own heart and my ragged breathing. And then the other 2 pairs of eyes shifted too. They weren't on the ground anymore either. I couldn't see them rise like the first one. It happened too fast, or maybe they were already higher up to begin with. But suddenly, All three pairs of eyes were at different heights, surrounding us, still fixed on us, like we were surrounded by, I don't even know what to call them, presences, menaces, something deeply, fundamentally wrong. For another frozen moment, everything just hung there, suspended in time and terror. Then, without any warning, without a sound, they moved. All three of them. They turned, and they vanished. Just like that. 1 second, those glowing red eyes were there, burning into us. The next, nothing. Gone. They just melted back into the darkness of the woods, faded away like smoke, like they'd never been there at all. Except they had. We'd both seen them. We both felt the terror of those eyes staring at us. And then the sound started. Not when they were still there, but as soon as they were gone. The sound of branches breaking, crashing and snapping further and further into the woods, away from the clearing. Like something big, heavy and fast was running through the undergrowth, tearing through bushes and knocking down branches. It was loud, really loud, violent, and under it, underneath the crashing and breaking, there was mumbling, murmuring sounds, low, guttural noises, like angry growls, but not quite growls, more like complaining, irritated muttering, deep, throaty sounds that sent shivers down my spine. The crashing and murmuring faded as whatever they were retreated deeper and deeper into the forest. The sound went on for a long time, or at least it felt like a long time. Time gets weird when you're that scared. Eventually the sounds just stopped, just like the eyes, they vanished. And then there was silence again. But it wasn't the same silence as before. This silence was heavy, oppressive, charged, like the air itself was vibrating with what had just happened. Jasper and I just stood there, lasers still pointing into the empty darkness where the eyes had been. We didn't move, didn't speak. I don't even think we breathed for a while. We were just frozen, stunned. The fear had gone, replaced by this blankness, this hollowed-out feeling, like something had been sucked out of us. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Jasper moved. Just a twitch, a little shake of his head. Then he lowered his laser pen. I did too, my hand shaking so badly I almost dropped it. We looked at each other. His face was white in the faint glow from his laser, his eyes wide and empty, like mine probably were. Did you see that?" he whispered. His voice was hoarse, barely audible. "Did you see the eyes?" "Yeah," I managed to croak out. "Yeah, I saw them." What else could I say? What could either of us say? What the hell was that, Jasper?" He shook his head again, slowly this time. I don't know, Ilara. I have no idea. And that's the thing. We don't know. We still don't. We've racked our brains about it, gone over it 1,000,000 times, tried to find some rational explanation, some animal, something that could account for what we saw, but there's nothing that fits. Glowing red eyes, 6 feet off the ground, furry things, disappearing into thin air, mumbling and complaining as they ran. It makes no sense. None. We got the hell out of that clearing. We practically ran back to the trailer, stumbling and tripping in the dark. We didn't stop until we were inside, doors locked, curtains drawn. We sat there for hours, huddled in the dim light of the trailer, not saying much, just staring at the walls, listening to every little creak and groan of the trailer itself. Every rustle outside sounded like those things coming back. We never went back to the clearing that night. We finished our shift from inside the trailer, making up excuses on the radio about equipment malfunction. The next morning, in the daylight, it all seemed almost unreal, like it had been a nightmare. But we both remembered. We both saw it. We both felt it. The terror, the confusion, the sheer impossibility of it. And that's it. That's all that happened. We finished our contract at Blackwood, thankfully. We couldn't wait to leave. We told the supervisors we were done. No explanation. Just done. And we haven't been back. Haven't wanted to go back. I still think about it sometimes. A lot, actually. Those eyes, burning red in the dark, the sound of the branches breaking, the mumbling. What were they? What did they want? Were they watching us before that night too? Are they still out there? I don't know. I wish I knew. But the truth is, I'm terrified of finding out. Some things are better left unseen. And some nights stay with you, forever changing the way you see the world. That night in the clearing, August 2nd, that's one of those nights for me. And honestly, I hope I never experience anything like it again. Ever. Story 5. Okay, so, this whole thing happened after some weird stuff already went down, which I won't even get into right now because this is about this, you know? Anyway, Jasper and I, we were staying out at Silent Creek. It's supposed to be like this chill getaway spot, right? Little trailers you can rent, the lake, nature, whatever. But things had already been off. Let's just put it like that. Off enough that we were both walking around on eggshells, you know, like waiting for something else weird to happen. So, the next day, after the other stuff, we were both just itching to get out of the trailer. Cabin fever, maybe, or just trying to convince ourselves that things were normal. Like if we just went for a hike in the woods, everything would magically go back to being fine. Stupid, I know. But that's what we thought. We needed to, reclaim the place, you know? Make it feel normal again. We decided to walk around Silent Creek, explore a bit. There's this dusty trail that goes from the trailers down to the lake. We walked that way, past our trailer, number 7, which is probably something I'm going to remember forever now, even though it's just a stupid number, and kept going, heading towards the water. The lake was still and quiet in the late afternoon. Sun was getting lower, starting to throw these long shadows through the trees. It was actually kind of beautiful in a way, if you ignored the knot of anxiety twisting in your stomach. We were talking, just normal stuff, trying to act like everything was completely fine, you know, look at that pretty bird, kinda talk, even though neither of us was really focusing. We were both just on edge, like every rustle of leaves was going to turn into something else. Paranoid. Then we saw this smaller path kind of branching off the main trail. It looked less used, overgrown a bit, but still definitely a path. Jasper, he's always been the adventurous one, was like, "Hey, let's see where this goes." I hesitated. Honestly, just wanted to stick to the main trail, someplace we knew. But the main trail just led down to the lake, and we wanted to explore, right? That was the plan. To map out the area, make it less unknown. So stupidly I agreed. We stepped onto this side path. It was instantly different. Thicker woods here, trees closer together, darker undergrowth. The air felt cooler, damper, even though it was still warm out in the sun. The light filtering through the leaves was patchy, dappled, and it played tricks on your eyes. Things looked like they were moving in your peripheral vision, even when you knew they weren't. We walked for maybe 10-15 minutes, just talking about nothing, when we heard it. It started soft, like at first I wasn't even sure if I'd really heard anything, just a faint, high-pitched sound. I stopped walking and listened, and Jasper stopped too, looking at me with this questioning look. "Did you hear that?" I asked him. He frowned, listening. "Yeah. Was that whistling?" "Whistling, yeah, that was it. But not just any whistling. It was melodic, like someone was actually whistling a tune. But a weird tune, not something you'd recognize, something unsettling." We stood there in the quiet woods, just listening. The whistling was faint, carried on the breeze maybe, but definitely there. It sounded fluty, almost. Like someone playing a flute, but through their lips. Soft and breathy and haunting. "Where's it coming from?" Jasper whispered, turning his head, trying to pinpoint the direction. I shrugged, doing the same. It was hard to tell in the woods, sounds bouncing off the trees. "Sounds like over there?" I pointed vaguely deeper into the trees on our right. We started walking again, slowly, carefully. The whistling continued. It didn't get louder or quieter, just there, like background music to our suddenly much less pleasant walk in the woods. And then it happened. We stopped to listen again, both of us really trying to figure out where it was coming from, and it stopped. The whistling just cut off, like someone had turned off a switch. Silence. Just the normal sounds of the woods. Rustling leaves, bird calls in the distance, the hum of insects. But no whistling. We looked at each other, confused. "Did it stop?" Jasper asked, voice still low. "Yeah," I whispered back. "Maybe whoever it was finished whistling?" It sounded stupid even as I said it. Who just wanders around in the woods whistling random creepy tunes? We stood there for a minute, listening, but the whistling didn't start again. "Maybe it was just someone passing by on another trail," Jasper said, trying to sound normal, trying to rationalize it. "Maybe," I said, but I didn't believe it. It felt too weird, too sudden. We started walking again, just to keep moving, to get out of that weird patch of woods or whatever, and as soon as our feet hit the path again, the whistling started up again. Just like that. Same soft, flute-like melody, same unsettling vibe. We stopped dead again. "What the—" Jasper started, his voice now definitely not calm. I felt a chill run down my spine. This wasn't right. This was intentionally creepy. We tried an experiment. We stood still, completely still, and listened. The whistling continued, soft and eerie. Then we took a step forward. The whistling kept going. We took another step, and another. It kept going. Then we stopped again. And silence. Just like before, the whistling just stopped the instant we stopped moving. We did it again. Started walking, and instantly, the whistling started up again. It was like it was tied to our movement, like it was following us. But that was impossible, right? It was just a coincidence. It had to be a coincidence. Except, deep down, I knew it wasn't. The feeling of being watched slammed into me then. Not just watched, but targeted. Like something out there was focusing on us, paying attention to us, reacting to our movements. And that sound, that creepy, melodic whistling, it felt like a marker, like it was saying, "I see you, I'm here." I looked around wildly, scanning the trees, the undergrowth, trying to see something, anything, a person, an animal, anything that could be making that sound. But there was nothing. Just trees and shadows and the deepening gloom of the late afternoon turning into early evening. "Okay," Jasper said, his voice tight. "This is weird, really weird." He was looking around too, his eyes wide, the color draining from his face. I could see the fear in him, the same fear that was starting to claw its way up my own throat. Let's go back," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Let's just go back to the trailer." Jasper nodded, quick and jerky. Yeah, let's do that." We turned around, back the way we'd come, and as soon as we started walking back down the path, the whistling started again, right behind us. It felt like it was right behind us, but when we stopped and spun around, scanning the trees, there was nothing. Just empty woods. It followed us. That's the only way to describe it. That sound, that creepy, flute-like whistling, followed us. It stayed the same distance behind us, wherever that distance was, soft and persistent and utterly terrifying, because we couldn't see where it was coming from, we couldn't understand it, and it felt directed at us, personally. We started to walk faster, then almost jog, then full-on run. Adrenaline flooded my system, heart pounding in my chest, breath coming in ragged gasps. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump. The whistling was still there, behind us, always behind us, a constant taunting soundtrack to our terrified flight through the woods. The shadows were getting longer, the woods getting darker. The trees seemed to close in around us, the path twisting and turning, feeling longer than it had on the way in. Panic started to set in. What if we couldn't get away? What if this thing, whatever it was, caught up to us? What was it? What did it want? We didn't talk. We just ran. Pounding down the path, branches whipping at our faces, lungs burning. The whistling was always there, always just behind us. It felt like it was mocking us, like it knew we were running and it was just playing with us, letting us think we could escape, but always staying close, always reminding us it was there. I started to cry as I ran, silent tears streaming down my face, mixing with the sweat and dirt. I was so scared. Scared in a way I hadn't been scared before. This wasn't a normal fear. This was primal, terrifying, unexplainable. And the whistling, that damn whistling, it just went on and on and on. Then, suddenly through the trees, I saw it. A patch of brighter light. Not the golden light of sunset anymore, but the colder, harsher light of the main road. The road that ran past the entrance to Silent Creek. Hope surged through me, mixed with the desperate exhaustion. The road, civilization, escape. We burst out of the trees and onto the road, stumbled onto the gravel shoulder, gasping for air, clutching at each other, legs shaking so badly we could barely stand. We stood there, panting, leaning on each other, staring back at the woods we'd just run out of, dark and silent and ominous. And then I realized the whistling was gone. Silence. Just the sounds of the road now, distant cars, the wind in the trees along the shoulder, but no whistling. Gone. Just like that. We stood there for a long time, just breathing, just listening, just trying to process what had just happened. The woods behind us were dark and still. It felt like they were watching us, even in silence. But the whistling was gone. Finally, Jasper spoke, his voice hoarse. "Is it gone?" I listened harder, straining my ears, still half expecting to hear it start up again any second. But no, nothing, just silence. "Yeah," I whispered. "Yeah, I think it's gone." We started to walk down the road, away from the woods, towards the lights of the small store up ahead. We walked quickly, not running, but definitely not slowing down. We didn't look back. We couldn't look back. We made it back to the trailer, locked the door, bolted it, drew the curtains, turned on every light we could find. Sat there in silence, still shaking, still terrified, just staring at each other. We haven't talked about it much since. Not really. What is there to say? "Hey, remember that time we got chased out of the woods by a ghost whistle?" It sounds insane, like something out of a bad horror movie, but it happened. It really, really happened. And I don't understand it. I don't know what it was, or who was doing it, or why. Was it just someone messing with us, some sick joke? But it felt more than that. It felt something else. Something wrong. Deeply wrong. And the silence now, the silence without the whistling, it's almost worse. Because now I'm just left with the questions, and the fear, and the knowing that something happened out there in those woods that day, something I can't explain and will probably never forget. And sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet, I still hear it, in my head, that soft, flute-like, creepy whistling. And I still get chills, even now, even just writing this down. It was real. Whatever it was real. And I don't know what to make of it. And that's the scariest part, I think. Just not knowing. Just being left with that feeling. Like something is still out there. Watching. Waiting. Whistling. Story 6. It was just supposed to be a quick trip. A few days in the woods to get away from everything. We'd found this spot up in Shadow Valley, Washington, a little clearing just off a Forest Service road where we could park our Chota trailer. August 6th. I remember the date exactly, like it's burned into my brain. even though nothing like this has ever happened to me before. The air was already turning cold as soon as the sun dipped below the trees. That deep, almost biting cold that tells you fall is just around the corner, even though it's still technically summer. We were running low on water. Stupidly, I hadn't filled up the tanks completely before we left town. We'd been trying to conserve, but after a couple of days, even doing dishes and quick showers sparingly, we were getting down to almost empty. Jasper, that's my dog, a big goofy lab mix, was panting extra hard too, which always makes me nervous about him getting dehydrated. So, late that evening, after the sun had completely set, I told Mark, my boyfriend, I was going to walk down to the little creek we'd seen marked on the map just a short way from our spot and refill our water jugs. Mark was fiddling with the lantern inside the trailer, trying to get it lit. He hates the woods after dark, gets super jumpy. "You sure you want to go now, Ilara? It's pitch black out there." "Yeah, it'll be fine. I'll take a flashlight." "And Jasper," I said, gesturing to the dog, who was already wagging his tail, thinking walkies. "We'll be quick." Honestly, I wasn't thrilled about going either. Even though we were close to the road, once you stepped into the trees, it was like entering a different world. The woods in Shadow Valley are dense, really dense. Tall pines and firs so close together, they block out most of the sky even in the daytime, let alone at night, with just a sliver of a moon. It's the kind of dark that swallows light. I grabbed our 2 big empty water containers, the flashlight, and clipped Jasper's leash on. It was colder than I'd expected. I pulled my hoodie tighter around me as we stepped out of the trailer. The air instantly felt different, crisper and heavy, with the smell of pine and damp earth. The path to the creek wasn't far, maybe a couple 100 yards. I'd walked it earlier in the day to scout it out. It was easy enough to follow even in the dark, mostly downhill, the ground springy with pine needles and fallen leaves. Jasper was pulling ahead, sniffing everything, his tail waving like a flag in the beam of my flashlight. The sounds were what got to you most out there at night. Not loud noises, not usually, but the little things. The rustle of leaves, branches creaking in the breeze. Though there wasn't much breeze that night, it was eerily still. The snap of a twig under your foot that echoed way too loudly in the silence. Every little noise seemed magnified, amplified by the darkness and the way the trees muffled everything else. We reached the creek. It was narrow, but the water was clear, rushing over smooth stones. The sound a soft murmur in the quiet night. Perfect for refilling the jugs. I set the containers down on the bank and knelt by the edge of the water, shining the flashlight down to see what I was doing. Jasper was sniffing around, nosing at the ground, occasionally lapping at the creek. I started filling the first jug, the sound of the water gurgling and splashing feeling strangely loud in the silence of the woods. And then I saw it. It wasn't a sound. It wasn't a movement at first. It was just a glint, a yellow spectral glow that caught my eye in my peripheral vision. Something over by the edge of the trees, just a few yards away on the other side of the creek. I froze, my hand still holding the water jug halfway full. I slowly lifted my head, my heart starting to hammer in my chest. I aimed the flashlight towards where I'd seen the light, my hand shaking slightly. At first, I saw nothing but darkness. Just the solid blackness of the woods beyond the creek bank. Maybe it was just a reflection, some trick of the moonlight. But the moon was tiny, a thin crescent, barely enough to cast any real light. Then, there it was again. 2 points of light, glowing yellow, burning in the dark. Like eyes. Reflecting my flashlight beam, but with their own internal light too, almost pulsing softly. They were low to the ground. Not high like deer eyes would be. Lower, much lower. Maybe a foot off the ground, maybe less. And they were fixed on me, staring directly at me. My breath hitched in my throat. I held the flashlight steady, trying to get a better look. I could make out a shape now, in the shadows just behind the glowing eyes. Darker than the darkness of the woods, almost like a void. A small shape, crouched low. I couldn't really see details, just blackness. And those eyes, they were intense, burning yellow. Not friendly eyes, not scared eyes, predatory eyes, intelligent eyes. They watched me with a focused intensity that sent a bolt of pure ice through my veins. Fear, real, primal fear. It slammed into me like a physical force. My muscles went rigid, my mouth went dry, my brain screamed danger, but my body seemed paralyzed. I couldn't move, I couldn't even breathe properly. Jasper, bless his heart, sensed something was wrong. He stopped sniffing and whining and looked up at me, his ears perked. Then he followed my gaze, his head tilting slightly, a low growl starting deep in his chest. The yellow eyes didn't flinch, they didn't move. They just kept watching, that intense, unsettling gaze locked on me. I don't know why, what possessed me to do it, but I mumbled something, barely a whisper. Stay. Stay there. It was meant for Jasper, to keep him from running off, from charging into the darkness towards whatever that was. But as soon as the words left my mouth, something shifted in the air. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A sense of stillness, a pause, as if whatever was out there had understood me, had heard me, had acknowledged my words. The yellow eyes didn't disappear, they didn't blink, they remained fixed, burning into me. But there was a different quality to them now. Less overtly aggressive, maybe? Hard to say. My brain was in overdrive, trying to process what I was seeing, trying to make sense of it, and coming up terrifyingly empty. Slowly, carefully, like I was moving in slow motion, I started to back away from the creek. One small step at a time, my eyes locked on those glowing yellow eyes. I didn't want to take my gaze off them, even for a second. I was afraid if I looked away, if I broke contact, whatever it was would what? I didn't know, but I didn't want to find out. Jasper stayed close to my side now, his growl rumbling low and steady. He was tense, his fur bristling slightly along his back. He knew something was wrong too. He felt it. I kept backing up, step by agonizing step, away from the creek, away from those eyes in the dark. I didn't turn around. I just kept my focus forward, towards the darkness, towards the yellow glow. I bumped into something solid. My foot hit a root or a rock. I stumbled, almost lost my balance. For a split second, my gaze flickered down to steady myself. When I looked back up, they were gone. The yellow eyes, the dark shape, vanished, just like that. As if they'd never been there at all. Nothing but trees and shadows and the faint murmur of the creek in the darkness. I stood there, frozen, for what felt like a long time. My heart was still pounding like a drum against my ribs. My breath was coming in ragged gasps. My legs felt weak and shaky. I blinked, trying to clear my head, wondering if I'd imagined it. If it had been some kind of hallucination, brought on by the darkness and the isolation and maybe a little bit of nerves. But I knew I hadn't imagined it. I'd seen them. I'd felt their gaze. I knew it was real. Jasper, I whispered, my voice trembling. Did you see that? He whined softly, nudging my hand with his nose, then looked back towards the woods, towards where the eyes had been, his ears still pricked, alert. He'd seen it too. I wasn't crazy. I didn't want to go back to the creek. I didn't want to fill the water jugs. Frankly, I just wanted to run, to get back to the trailer, back to the small circle of light and perceived safety. But we needed water. We really did. Taking a deep breath, trying to force some semblance of calm, I reached down, picked up the half-filled water jug, and slowly started filling the second one. My hands were still shaking. I kept glancing back over my shoulder, scanning the edge of the trees, my flashlight beam dancing nervously in the darkness. Nothing. Just darkness and shadows. The creek murmuring, Jasper sniffing at the ground, the rustling of leaves in the faint night breeze that had finally picked up. I finished filling the second jug, capped them tightly, and grabbed the handles. "Come on, Jasper," I said, my voice still shaky, but a little stronger now. "Let's go." We turned and hurried back towards the path, practically running in our haste to get out of there. I kept the flashlight beam fixed on the path ahead, not wanting to look back, not wanting to see if those eyes were still watching us from the shadows. When we got back to the trailer, Mark was still messing with the lantern. He looked up as we came in, his face tight with worry. "What took you so long?" I was starting to get freaked out. I just shook my head, unable to speak for a moment. I set the water jugs down with a thump, unclipped Jasper's leash, and just stood there, breathing hard. "Ilara, what is it? You look like you've seen a ghost." He came over, put his hand on my arm, his brow furrowed with concern. I finally managed to find my voice. "Mark, I saw something down by the creek." He rolled his eyes, relief flooding his face. "Probably just a deer or a raccoon or an owl. You know how your imagination runs wild in the dark." "No, it wasn't a deer," I said firmly. I don't know what it was, but it was small, dark, and it had these eyes, yellow eyes, glowing yellow eyes, and it was watching me." I told him what I'd seen, trying to describe the shape, the eyes, the feeling of being watched, the chilling stillness in the air. He listened, his expression changing slowly from skepticism to something more uncertain. "Yellow eyes?" he repeated, scratching his chin. "Small? Down low to the ground?" He thought for a moment. "Maybe a fox? Foxes can have yellowish eyes." "No," I said. "It wasn't a fox. It was darker, shadowier. And the eyes, they were different. They were brighter. And they felt intelligent. Like they were thinking, watching me, really watching me, not just some animal startled by a light." Mark was silent for a long moment. He looked out the small window of the trailer into the inky blackness beyond. "Well," he said finally, slowly, "I don't know what to tell you, Ilara. I didn't see anything." "I know," I said. "You weren't there." We didn't talk about it much more that night. Mark dismissed it as my nerves, the dark, and maybe seeing something reflected weirdly in the creek water. He wanted to believe it was nothing, and honestly, a part of me wanted to believe him, to chalk it up to an overactive imagination, to the shadows playing tricks. But I couldn't shake the image of those yellow eyes, burning in the darkness, watching me. We stayed one more night in Shadow Valley. But I didn't go outside after dark again unless I absolutely had to, and then only with Mark. And we kept the lantern burning brightly outside the trailer all night long. We left the next morning. I wanted to get out of those woods, to get back to civilization, back to light and noise and people, back to feeling safe. I still think about it sometimes. Those yellow eyes in the dark. I've tried to research to see if there are any animals around there that match the description. Foxes, coyotes, bobcats, sure. But none of them feel right. None of them fit the feeling I had, the intensity of those eyes, the unnerving sense of intelligence. Sometimes, when I'm out walking Jasper at night, in my own neighborhood, under the streetlights, I'll catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow in the darkness between houses, and for a split second my heart will leap into my throat. And I'll think of those yellow eyes in Shadow Valley, and I'll remember the cold, sharp fear, the feeling of being watched, of being something's prey. And I'll know deep down that whatever I saw that night, it wasn't just my imagination. It was real, and it was out there, still out there, somewhere in the darkness of Shadow Valley, watching, waiting. And I have no idea what it was, and that's honestly the scariest part. I just don't know, and I probably never will. Idris, story 7. Okay, it happened back in August 7th to be exact. I remember the date so clearly because it's like everything before that day is faded now, like my life split into 2 parts. Before August 7th and after, we were up in Havenwood, Washington. Me and Jasper, my Well, he was my boyfriend then. We were working a small logging gig. Not glamorous, but it paid the bills, and we liked being out in the woods, away from everything. We had this little beat-up trailer we were staying in, parked on the edge of a clearing. Nothing fancy, but it was home for the summer. Those Washington summers are beautiful, especially when the sun's going down. During the day, the bugs would eat you alive, mosquitoes the size of quarters, and these biting flies that were just relentless. Nightfall was the only time you could actually breathe, get anything done without wanting to scratch your skin off. That's why I was outside that evening. The sun was just dipping below the trees, that long, slow fade you get in the mountains. Everything was bathed in this orange-pink light, kind of hazy and peaceful. Except for the damn bugs, even they were starting to quiet down. Jasper was inside the trailer, messing with something, I don't remember what. Probably cleaning his tools or sharpening a saw. I needed to check on the equipment. We'd been using the skidder pretty hard that day, dragging logs, and I wanted to make sure everything was still good to go for the morning. Preventative maintenance, you know? Saves you headaches later. So I stepped out of the trailer and into that evening air. It was cool and damp, smelled like pine needles and wet earth, that clean, woody smell I usually loved. I walked out into the clearing, heading towards where we'd parked the skidder, near the tree line that bordered a little creek, and that's when I heard it. At first, I wasn't even sure what it was. It was loud, like a really heavy breath, but not just any breath. It was gasping, almost like someone drowning, or maybe someone running so hard they were about to collapse. Ha, 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 it went, really deep and raspy, like air being forced in and out of something huge. It was coming from the direction of the creek, maybe 50, 60 feet into the woods. The creek was narrow there, mostly hidden by thick bushes and trees, but I knew it was there. My first thought was an animal. A bear, maybe, or an elk. We'd seen both around Havenwood before, but mostly during the day. Still, the sound didn't quite fit either. Bears can huff and puff, but this was different, more labored, heavier. Curiosity, I guess, and maybe a little bit of that checking things out instinct kicked in. I started walking towards the sound, slowly, carefully, trying not to make any noise myself. The woods were getting darker fast now, the twilight fading into full-on night. It was that in-between time where everything looks a little distorted, shadows stretching and playing tricks on your eyes. I moved as quiet as I could, stepping softly on the pine needles, trying to see through the trees and bushes. The sound was getting louder as I got closer, definitely coming from right by the creek. Ha ha, ha ha! It was rhythmic, but uneven, like whatever was making it was struggling. Then I saw it. At first it was just a shape, a dark, hulking shape down by the creek. It was almost completely black against the darkening woods, a massive silhouette hunched over the water. My first real thought was bear. A big bear, probably getting a drink before settling in for the night. Made sense. Bears drink, right? And the creek was the closest water source. But then it moved. It wasn't the way a bear moves. It started to straighten up, slowly. And as it rose, whatever I thought I was looking at just evaporated, like fog burning off in the sun. This wasn't a bear. This wasn't an elk. This wasn't anything I had ever seen or even imagined existed. It just kept getting bigger as it stood, taller and taller, rising out of the darkness like a tree trunk, but alive. When it was finally upright, I could see it better in the fading light, and my breath just stopped, like my lungs just forgot how to work. It was hairy, completely covered in hair, thick, reddish-brown hair, matted and shaggy, like a mangy dog, but on something that was easily 8 feet tall, maybe more. It was massive, broad-shouldered, with arms that hung down almost to its knees. Its back was hunched, but not like an old person hunched over, more like powerful, coiled. The head was indistinct, shadowed. I couldn't make out clear features, but I could see it was roundish, set low on its shoulders, no neck to speak of. And the hair, it covered everything. Even its face, I think, was hidden under that thick mat of reddish fur. It was standing there right by the creek, and the gasping sounds, the ha-ha, were still coming from it. It sounded wet, almost gurgling now, like it had just dunked its head in the water. I could hear the water dripping from it, plip, 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 in the sudden silence that had fallen in the woods. The insects had stopped buzzing. Everything was quiet except for the dripping water and my own heart hammering in my chest. I was frozen, absolutely frozen. Fear, it's a weird thing. It wasn't like movie fear, screaming and running. It was paralyzing, like my body just shut down. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even breathe properly. My mind was just screaming, no, 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 this isn't real, this isn't happening. It stood there for what felt like forever, but was probably only seconds. Just this huge, hairy, silent thing. Then it moved again. It took a step, just one step, but it was enough to snap me out of it. It stepped over a fallen log, just a thick, mossy trunk that had been lying across the creek bed for years. This thing stepped over it like it was a twig, like it weighed nothing. The way it moved, it was surprisingly agile for something so big, graceful almost, which made it even more terrifying. That step, that sudden fluid movement from something so massive, that's what broke the spell. My brain finally kicked back in, screaming, "Run!" And I ran. I turned and bolted back towards the trailer as fast as I could. I didn't even think, just pure instinct. Get away, get away, get away. I was running through the trees, branches whipping my face, stumbling over roots. But I didn't care. I just ran. I started yelling, "Jasper! Jasper!" I screamed as loud as I could, my voice cracking with fear. "Jasper! There's something out here! Jasper!" Behind me, I heard it. I didn't see it, not directly. I was too busy running, too terrified to look back. But I heard it. It roared, not a bear roar, not a cougar scream, not anything like any animal sound I had ever heard. It was deeper, louder, more primal, like something ripped from the earth itself. It was a guttural bellow, a roar that vibrated in my chest, that shook the ground under my feet. It echoed through the woods, bouncing off the trees, deafening. It wasn't just a roar of anger or aggression. It sounded almost mournful, desperate. I don't know how to describe it, except that it was the most terrifying sound I've ever heard in my life. I kept running, screaming Jasper's name, my lungs burning, my legs aching. I burst out of the trees and into the clearing, the trailer just a few yards away. The door swung open, and Jasper was there, standing in the doorway, eyes wide, face pale. He'd heard the roar too. He had to have. It was impossible not to hear that. "Ilara, what the hell?" he started to say, but he saw my face and he stopped. He knew something was terribly wrong. It's out there," I gasped, pointing back towards the woods, still shaking, trying to catch my breath. "Something huge, hairy. I don't know what it is, Jasper. It's monstrous." He looked at me, his eyes searching mine, trying to figure out if I was joking, if I'd gone crazy. But he saw the genuine terror in my face, the tears welling up in my eyes. He saw that this was real. "What did you see?" he asked, his voice low, serious. I don't know. By the creek. It was drinking, I think. And then it stood up. Jasper, it was gigantic, like a man, but not, covered in hair. And it roared. You heard it, right? You heard that roar?" He nodded slowly, his face grim. "Yeah, I heard it. Sounded unearthly." We stood there for a moment, just staring at each other, listening. The woods were silent again, except for the crickets starting to chirp. Too silent. The kind of silence that feels heavy, threatening. Then Jasper did something stupid. Brave, maybe, but stupid. He grabbed the flashlight from inside the trailer, a big maglite, and started walking towards the edge of the clearing, towards the woods. "Jasper, "What are you doing?" I whispered, panicked, grabbing his arm. "Don't go back in there, whatever that thing is." "I just want to see," he said, his voice tight. "Just want to see if it's still there, if it's gone." "No, don't," I pleaded, pulling on his arm, but he shook me off gently. "Stay here," he said, his eyes fixed on the tree line. "Lock the door. If anything happens, just get in the truck and drive. Get out of here." He moved forward, slowly, cautiously, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, illuminating the trees, the bushes. I watched him from the doorway of the trailer, my heart pounding, every muscle in my body tense. He reached the edge of the woods, hesitated for a moment, then stepped inside. The flashlight beam disappeared into the trees, bobbing and weaving as he moved. I could hear him crashing through the undergrowth, even though he was trying to be quiet. The silence of the woods was shattered now by the sounds of his movements and my own frantic breathing. Minutes crawled by. Each second felt like an eternity. I stood there frozen, staring into the darkness, listening for any sound, anything. The roar again, Jasper yelling, even just the sound of branches breaking, but there was nothing, just the crickets and the whisper of the wind in the trees. Then, just as I was about to completely lose it, about to run into the woods after him, screaming his name again, he came back. He emerged from the trees, walking slowly, the flashlight beam steady in his hand. He looked different. His face was even paler than before. His eyes were wide and haunted. He walked up to the trailer, stepped inside, and closed the door behind him. He didn't say anything for a moment, just stood there, breathing heavily, his eyes still fixed on something far away. "Did you see it?" I whispered, my voice trembling. He shook his head slowly. "No," he said finally, his voice hoarse. "It's gone." "But what was it, Jasper? What was that thing?" He looked at me then, really looked at me, and there was something in his eyes I had never seen before. Fear. Raw, primal fear, the kind that gets under your skin and stays there. "I don't know, Ilara," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I really don't know." We stayed in that trailer the rest of the night, doors locked, windows closed, every light on. We didn't sleep. We just sat there, listening to every little sound, jumpy at every creak of the trailer, every rustle of leaves outside. We were both terrified, but more than that, we were bewildered, completely out of our depth. We had no explanation for what I had seen, what we had heard. No explanation for the sheer, bone-chilling dread that had settled over us. The next morning, we packed up everything we could, as fast as we could. We didn't even finish the logging job. We just left. We hitched up the trailer, jumped in the truck, and drove away from Havenwood. And we didn't look back. We haven't talked about it much since. Not really. We tried a few times, but words just fail. There are no words to describe what I saw, what I felt that night. It was something else, something ancient, something that shouldn't be. Sometimes late at night I still hear that roar in my head, that deep mournful bellow echoing through the trees, and I see that shape, that massive hairy silhouette rising out of the darkness, and I feel that cold, paralyzing fear grip me all over again. I don't know what it was. I don't know what it wanted. I just know that it was real. I saw it, and I'll never forget it. Never. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, in those woods, watching, listening, and I hope I never see it again, ever. I really, truly hope so, because I don't think I could survive another encounter like that. It changed something in me that night, something fundamental, and I'm not sure I'll ever be the same. Story 8. We hadn't slept right for days, not since we got to Whispering Pines, even before. There was just this feeling in the air, thick and wrong, like when a storm's coming, but it's not weather, it's something else, something alive and waiting. Last night, well, Last night had blown all of that simmering dread right out of the water. Last night was full-on terror. I still can't really talk about it without my stomach turning over. But the thing is, even after that, even after seeing what we saw, the night wasn't over. And in some ways, what came next, in the black hours that followed, might be even worse, because it was like the full weight of what we were in truly hit us then. The morning after, or rather, what should have been morning because it was still pitch black, was awful. We were huddled in the travel trailer, every window covered, door bolted, heart hammering against ribs. It felt like the air itself was vibrating with something unseen, some presence that lingered just beyond the thin aluminum walls. Jasper kept saying it was just adrenaline, just us being freaked out from last night. But I knew it was more than that. It was like being watched, like being a bug under a microscope, pinned down and analyzed by eyes you couldn't see, but felt burning into you. We were whisper-talking, afraid even to breathe too loud. We were out of water, completely dry. We'd gone through what we had faster than we planned, between being jumpy and on edge all the time and just the dryness in your mouth when you're that scared. Plus, after last night, honestly, even thinking about drinking water was making my stomach queasy. "We gotta get water," Jasper finally murmured, his voice scratchy like he hadn't used it in days. "We can't stay like this." I nodded, knowing he was right, but every cell in my body screamed against leaving the trailer. It felt like the only safe spot, even though I knew deep down it probably wasn't. If that thing wanted to get in, a flimsy door and thin walls wouldn't stop it. But still, the idea of stepping outside into that darkness again. "The creek," I whispered back. "It's closest, right?" He nodded, chewing his lip, staring at the floor like he could see right through it to whatever was lurking outside. "Yeah, closest. But still." "But still what, Jasper?" I snapped, my nerves frayed. "We gonna die of thirst in here? We gotta do something." He flinched, then took a deep breath, trying to force some kind of calm. Okay. Creek it is. We go together. Stay close to the trailer, just run to the tree line, follow it down to the water, fill the jugs, and haul ass back here. Quick and quiet. Like we're ghosts. "Ghosts that need water," I muttered, but I felt a little bit of steel return to my spine, just having a plan. Staying passive was killing me. Doing something, even if it was terrifying, felt a tiny bit better. We got ready like we were prepping for war, grabbed the empty water jugs, flashlights, and Jasper insisted on taking the hunting knife. "Just in case," he said, not meeting my eyes. Like a knife was going to do anything against that. But I didn't argue. Anything to feel like we weren't completely helpless. We cracked the door open a sliver, peering out into the pre-dawn gloom. It was that kind of deep, thick darkness where you can't see past your own hand. The kind that swallows sound too, muffling everything and making every little snap of a twig or rustle of leaves sound deafening. The air outside was heavy, colder than it should have been for late summer, and smelled damp and earthy, like rotting leaves and wet soil, and something else underneath it, something faint and musky. An animal smell, but too big to be just a deer or a fox. We stepped out, sticking to the shadows of the trailer. Each step felt agonizingly slow, like we were wading through molasses. My heart hammered so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. Every rustle, every shadow made me jump. I kept expecting something to explode out of the darkness, teeth and claws and that thing. We edged along the side of the trailer, hugging the cold metal, until we reached the edge of the trees. The creek was just beyond the tree line, maybe 50 yards away. Usually it would be nothing, a quick walk in the woods. Now it felt like crossing a minefield. We slipped into the trees, the darkness closing in around us, the shadows deeper, more alive. The air under the canopy was even colder, heavy with the smell of pine and damp earth. We moved like snails, inching forward, flashlights held low, trying to pierce the gloom without drawing too much attention. Though to what exactly we didn't know. Or maybe we did, deep down, and that was the most terrifying part of it all. We reached the creek bank, the sound of water trickling over rocks, a tiny whisper in the heavy silence. It was a small creek, barely more than a stream, but enough. Enough to live. For now. Jasper knelt at the edge, dipping a jug into the water, his flashlight beam cutting a weak path through the dark. I stood behind him, scanning the woods, my flashlight sweeping back and forth, uselessly trying to penetrate the wall of blackness. The sound started softly, almost lost in the murmur of the creek. A rustle in the undergrowth, then another, louder, closer, branches snapping, leaves crunching underfoot. Not like a deer, heavier, deliberate, and coming from the woods just beyond the clearing by the creek, the same direction as last night. My breath hitched. I grabbed Jasper's arm, squeezing hard. "Jasper! Listen!" He froze, jug half full, head cocked, flashlight beam fixed on the water. Then he heard it too. The sounds were clearer now, closer, unmistakably footsteps, heavy footsteps, moving through the woods, toward us. Panic flared in my chest, hot and sharp. It was happening again. It was back, or still here, waiting. Jasper dropped the jug, splashing water, scrambling to his feet. His eyes were wide, pupils blown black in the dim light. Fear, pure and raw, mirrored my own. "Run," I breathed, the word barely a whisper. He shook his head, glancing back towards the trailer, then back at the woods. "Too far, too slow. We gotta do something." His voice was trembling, but there was a desperate edge to it now, a flicker of something else mixed in with the fear. Anger, defiance, and then, in a move that made my blood run cold, Jasper started picking up rocks. Not small pebbles, but fist-sized stones from the creek bed. He hefted one, then another, his knuckles white, his eyes fixed on the darkness where the footsteps were coming from. "Jasper, what are you doing?" I hissed, grabbing his arm again. "Are you crazy? Just be quiet. Maybe it'll go away." He ignored me, hefting a third rock. "It's not going away, Alara. It's hunting us." He stared into the black woods, his face a pale mask in the darkness. "And I'm not just going to stand here and wait for it." Then, before I could stop him, before I could even understand what he was doing, he threw the first rock. He wound up and threw it hard, into the blackness towards the sounds, yelling, "Hey! Get out of here! Leave us alone!" The rock disappeared into the dark with a soft thud, landing somewhere in the undergrowth. For a second, there was silence. Just the creek, our ragged breathing, and the pounding of my heart. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him he was going to get us killed, but the words choked in my throat. I just stared at him, at the black woods, paralyzed with fear. And then the reaction came, immediate, brutal. Not from where the rock landed, but from deeper in the woods, closer than before. A roar, not like any animal I'd ever heard. Deeper, more guttural, laced with a pure, unadulterated rage that vibrated through the air, through the ground, right into my bones. The trees around us seemed to shudder, and then it started shaking a tree. Not like wind shaking it, but deliberate, violent, like some giant hand had clamped onto the trunk and was wrenching it back and forth with impossible force. Branches cracked and splintered, leaves tore off in showers, the shaking grew more and more frenzied, the roaring growing louder, closer. Then, with a final sickening crack, the tree snapped. It fell with a deafening crash, ripping through the undergrowth, the sound echoing through the silent woods like an explosion. The ground vibrated beneath my feet. I screamed, a high, thin shriek of pure terror that ripped through the night. Jasper stumbled back, eyes wide, dropping the remaining rocks. Even he was beyond bravado now. The raw, monstrous power on display was undeniable, overwhelming. This wasn't just some animal. This was something else, something ancient and furious and impossibly strong. He fumbled for something, anything. His hand closed around the handle of the hunting knife, but it was useless, pointless, like bringing a butter knife to a tank battle. Then his gaze fell on something else, hanging from his belt, his gun, the hunting rifle, the one he swore he'd only use for deer. Without a word, without even looking at me, he ripped it from his belt, fumbling to chamber a round. His hands were shaking so badly he almost dropped it. I stared at him, my mind blank, frozen in terror. He raised the rifle, pointing it blindly towards the darkness where the tree had fallen, towards the source of that earth-shattering roar. He didn't aim, didn't think, he just reacted. Pure, desperate, fear-driven instinct. He squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked through the night, echoing off the trees, ripping through the heavy silence like a physical force. The flash of light blinded me for a second. The smell of gunpowder filled the air, acrid and sharp. Then, silence. A heavy, oppressive silence that descended even thicker, even deeper than before. The roar was gone, the shaking stopped, just silence. Except for the creek, still gurgling on, oblivious to the terror that had just unfolded. We stood there, frozen, hearts pounding, lungs burning, ears ringing from the gunshot. The silence stretched on, each second feeling like an eternity, waiting, listening, dreading what would come next. And then, it did. Not from in front of us, from the direction of the fallen tree, but from above, from higher up the slope, in the clearing behind us, back towards the trailer, a sound, a call, guttural, deep, like a growl, but not from the throat, from somewhere deeper, somewhere inside the chest, vibrating through the air. It echoed through the trees, resonant and menacing. We both turned, our flashlights swinging wildly, trying to pierce the darkness uphill. Nothing, just blackness, trees, shadows. But the sound, it had come from up there, clear as day. And then, from behind us, from deeper in the woods, further down the creek, coming from the direction we had just come from. Another sound, different this time, higher pitched, sharper, still guttural, but almost questioning, like an answer to the first call. We whipped around, flashlights jerking back and forth, hearts seizing in our chests. Behind us, also nothing, just more trees, more darkness. But that sound, that second call, it hadn't been the same. It had been distinct. And then, in that moment, in the paralyzing grip of terror, it hit us. The realization slammed into us like a physical blow, knocking the breath from our lungs. Two calls, from two different directions. Not one creature, two, communicating. In the darkness of whispering pines, we weren't just dealing with one monster. We were caught in the middle of something else entirely, something bigger, something we couldn't even begin to understand. Territory, pack, family, I don't know, I don't understand it to this day. But in that moment, staring into the impenetrable blackness, listening to the silence that had fallen again, the silence that felt even more menacing now, knowing there were two of them, maybe more, out there in the woods. All the blood drained from my face. My knees went weak. I felt like I was going to faint. We were trapped, truly trapped. Not just in the trailer, not just in the woods, trapped in something bigger, something unknown and hostile, and infinitely more terrifying than anything we could have ever imagined. And the night was far from over. It had just shifted, become something even darker, even more impossible to comprehend. And we were right in the heart of it, and we were completely, utterly alone. To this day, I still wake up in a cold sweat, hearing those calls in my nightmares. That first deep growl, then that sharp, questioning answer. I see those trees shaking, hear that tree crashing down, and I feel that bone-chilling realization. Not one, but two. And I know, whatever they were still out there, watching, waiting. And we were in their woods, and we were never, ever going to be the same. Story 9. Okay, so this happened a couple of years back. My family, me, my wife Brenda, and our two teenagers, Jessica and Kevin, we decided to get away from everything for a long weekend. Montana sounded good, and we picked Shadow Creek State Park. Seemed nice online, you know, lots of trees, hiking trails, the whole outdoorsy vibe. Saturday afternoon, we got there, set up the tent, the usual camping stuff. By then, it was already getting late afternoon, but we were itching to get on a trail, stretch our legs after the drive. We picked Morgana Trail, looked like a decent loop, nothing too strenuous. The woods were dense, like really dense, pine trees mostly, really tall and close together, blocking out a lot of the light even though it was still daytime. It was quiet too, except for us walking and the occasional bird. That pine smell though, it was strong, kind of thick in the air. For a while it was actually nice, peaceful. You forget how quiet it can be in the woods when you live in the city. The kids, Jess and Kevin, they were up ahead naturally, teenagers always racing. Brenda and I were lagging behind, just enjoying the walk, talking about, I don't even remember what anymore, typical stuff probably. We'd been walking for maybe an hour, give or take, when the trail started going uphill a bit. Nothing steep, just a gentle climb. We came to this little clearing, and there was a picnic table, kind of old and weathered looking, like it had been there for years. It was right on top of this little rise, so you could kind of see out through the trees a bit, although mostly it was still just more trees. Brenda and I decided to take a quick break at the table, catch our breath. The kids were still further up the trail, around a bend. We couldn't see them anymore, but it had been quiet. We figured they were just still hiking. We were just leaning against the table, catching our breath, when we heard it. Screaming. High-pitched, frantic screaming. Jess and Kevin. It cut through the quiet of the woods like a knife. My heart just jumped into my throat. Brenda's hand tightened on my arm. We both took off running without saying a word. All you think about in that moment is something's happened to your kids. I was sprinting up the trail, my lungs burning already, fear just pumping adrenaline through me. We rounded the bend, and there they were. Jess and Kevin, standing in the middle of the trail, just frozen. Their faces were white as sheets, eyes wide, pointing into the woods on the right side of the trail. They were still making these small, choked sounds, whimpering more than screaming now. "What? What happened?" I yelled, out of breath. Brenda was right behind me, just as panicked. Jess couldn't even speak at first, just kept pointing. Kevin finally managed to get out, in this shaky whisper. "There, in the trees. It was a man." "A man? What man? Did someone hurt you?" Brenda was looking around wildly, like expecting someone to jump out. Kevin shook his head, eyes still glued to the trees. "No, not a man, not really. Hairy, giant, hairy man, watching us." His voice trailed off, like he was afraid to even say it. "Hairy man," I repeated, confused. I stepped closer to where they were pointing, squinting into the trees. It was just trees, thick underbrush, pine needles on the ground, normal wood stuff, sunlight filtering through the branches. Nothing. "There's nobody there," I said, trying to sound calm, even though my own heart was still pounding. "Are you sure you saw someone? Maybe it was just shadows or an animal?" I was grasping at straws. Jess started to cry again, quietly, tears streaming down her face. "No, Dad. It was big and hairy. It was watching us. It went in there." She pointed deeper into the woods, further from the trail. Brenda was trying to comfort her. "Okay, honey, okay. It's all right now. We're here. Let's just calm down and tell us what you saw." Kevin was still in shock, but he was a bit more coherent. "We were walking and we heard something moving in the trees, like heavy. And then we looked and we saw it, standing there, big, covered in hair. It was just staring at us." He shuddered. "Then it went that way." He pointed in the same direction Jess had. I looked again. Still nothing. I walked a few steps into the trees, pushing aside some branches, scanning the area. Silence. Just the sounds of the forest again, birds chirping now like nothing had happened. I felt stupid, like I was looking for monsters in a kid's fairy tale. "There's nothing here," I said, coming back to them. "Maybe you just got spooked by a deer or something. Deer can be big, especially if you don't expect them." "It wasn't a deer, Dad. It was like a monster," Jess said, her voice still shaky. Brenda gave me a look like, "Don't dismiss them." I knew she was right. They were genuinely terrified. Something had really scared them. We decided to head back to the picnic table, maybe get some water, let everyone calm down. We walked slowly, all of us looking around, a bit on edge now. The woods didn't seem as peaceful anymore. There was this undercurrent of something else now, something uneasy. We got back to the picnic table, sat down. The sun was starting to dip a bit lower now. The shadows were getting longer. The air felt cooler too. And then we heard it. Crack. Loud. Sharp. Like someone had hit a tree trunk with a baseball bat. It echoed through the woods. It came from somewhere deeper in the trees, away from the trail, the same direction the kids had pointed. We all froze, staring at each other. Did we all hear that? Crack. Crack. Two more. Closer now, it seemed. Definitely wood hitting wood. Not like branches breaking in the wind. These were deliberate, powerful sounds. Crack, 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 crack. Four more in quick succession, now from a different direction, from further down the hill, closer to where we'd come from. It was like they were surrounding us. My blood turned to ice. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't natural. There was something intentional about these sounds, something threatening. Brenda's eyes were wide with fear now. Jess and Kevin were huddled together, clinging to each other. Even I was starting to feel a real jolt of panic. We were alone, in the middle of nowhere, on top of this hill, and something was making these sounds, circling us. "What? What is that?" Brenda whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I said honestly. I had no idea. My mind was racing, trying to come up with some rational explanation, but nothing was making sense. A woodpecker, but that loud, and from multiple directions, and that deliberate rhythm. It was like communication. The knocks kept coming. Sometimes single cracks, sometimes in clusters, always loud, always echoing through the silent woods. They were definitely moving. We could hear the difference in direction, in distance. They were closing in. Panic started to set in, for real now. We were trapped, on this hilltop, with whatever was out there, and the sun was going down. It was going to be dark soon. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice urgent now. "Come on, let's go, back to the campsite." Brenda grabbed her phone. "I'm calling my sister. Sarah's camping nearby, remember? With that wildlife group?" "Yes, Sarah. My sister-in-law, Brenda's sister. She was always doing outdoorsy stuff, camping, hiking, knew all about animals and stuff. And she was camping nearby, somewhere in Shadow Creek, with a bunch of her friends, some kind of nature enthusiast group. Maybe she would know what this was, or at least she could help us." Brenda dialed Sarah, her hands shaking. "It rang. Rang. Please pick up." Finally, she answered. Brenda's voice was tight with panic as she started talking, trying to explain what was happening. The kids, the hairy man, the banging sounds in the woods. Sarah kept interrupting, asking her to calm down, to repeat things. She sounded confused, like she wasn't quite understanding the urgency in Brenda's voice at first. But then Brenda must have gotten through to her because Sarah's tone changed. She started asking more serious questions. "Wood knocks? From all around you? Are you sure it's not just branches falling?" Brenda shook her head, even though Sarah couldn't see her. "No, it's not branches. It's like someone is banging on trees with something hard. It's loud, Sarah, really loud. And it's moving, it's all around us." I could hear Sarah's voice, muffled, coming from Brenda's phone. She sounded more serious now. Stay there. Don't move. Tell me exactly where you are. Morgana Trail, near the picnic table at the top of the hill? Okay, I think I know where that is. We're not too far. We can get to you. Relief washed over us. Sarah was coming. We wouldn't be alone anymore. How long? Brenda asked. Give us 15-20 minutes maybe. We need to pack up some stuff, get our flashlights. Just stay put and keep your phone on. Okay, hurry, Brenda said, her voice still trembling. She hung up and just sagged against me, letting out a long breath. She's coming. They're coming. It was a huge relief, but the knocks didn't stop. If anything, they seemed to get louder, more frequent. The woods were getting darker now too, the shadows deepening. It was still light, but that twilight kind of light, where everything starts to look different, distorted. We stayed huddled at the picnic table, listening to the knocks, watching the tree line, jumping at every sound. The kids were silent now, just staring, their faces pale in the fading light. Brenda kept glancing at her phone, checking the time. Every minute felt like an hour. And then we heard voices. Faint at first from down below, from the base of the hill. Voices and the sound of crunching leaves and branches breaking. They were coming. Sarah and her friends. Hello, Brenda. It was Sarah's voice echoing through the woods. Sarah, we're up here at the picnic table, Brenda yelled back, relief flooding her voice. We could hear them getting closer, their flashlights bobbing between the trees below. 7 of them, 7 figures emerging from the woods at the bottom of the hill. Sarah was in the lead, flashlight in hand, her face etched with concern. Behind her were 6 others, men and women, all carrying flashlights, backpacks, some with hiking poles. They looked prepared, serious. They hurried up the hill to where we were. Sarah rushed to Brenda, hugging her tight. Are you okay? What happened? Brenda started to explain again. The hairy man, the knocks, the fear. Sarah listened, nodding, her eyes serious. Then she turned to her friends and said something to them in a low voice. They nodded and started spreading out a bit, scanning the woods with their flashlights. One of the men, older with a beard, came over to me. You said wood knocks? Can you show me where you heard them? He asked, his voice calm but alert. I pointed in the directions we'd heard the sounds from. He nodded. He and a couple of others started walking carefully towards the tree line, their flashlights cutting through the darkness now. The sun had almost completely set. The woods were dark, except for the beams of their flashlights. They went into the trees, shining their lights around, calling out softly, "Hello, is anyone there? Hello?" Just normal, calm voices, but there was an undercurrent of tension in the air. We stood at the picnic table, watching them, holding our breath. The woods were silent now. The knocks had stopped. It was just quiet, eerily quiet. After a few minutes, they came back, shaking their heads. Nothing, the older man said. No sign of anything, just woods. He looked at the kids. You said you saw something? He asked Kevin. Kevin nodded, but he just looked scared and confused. Yeah, big, hairy. It went in there. He pointed to the woods again. The man nodded slowly. We didn't see anything. But sometimes things are good at hiding in the woods. He looked around, his gaze sweeping over the trees. Let's take another look, just to be sure. They spread out again, this time further into the trees, deeper into the darkness. We waited. The silence was deafening. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves, the snapping of twigs under their feet, the faint hum of the forest at night. They were gone for longer this time. When they came back, they still hadn't found anything. No tracks, no broken branches, no hairy man. Just trees, shadows, and the deepening darkness of the night. The older man, he looked thoughtful, his brow furrowed. Well, he said finally, could have been anything, could have been nothing. But better safe than sorry, right? He looked at Brenda and me. "You folks want to pack up and come back to our campsite? It's not too far from here. We got a campfire going, plenty of food, and safety in numbers, right?" It sounded like the best idea in the world. We didn't hesitate. We quickly packed up our stuff. Thankfully, we hadn't unpacked too much yet, with the help of Sarah and her friends. They were all really calm and efficient, like they'd done this kind of thing before. They packed our gear, helped us carry it, making sure we all stayed together. They were armed with bear spray, we saw, tucked into their belts, and some of them had bigger flashlights, almost like spotlights. We walked down the hill and then out of the woods, back towards the main park road, towards Sarah's campsite. It was a different campsite, larger, more open, with a big roaring campfire already going, casting flickering light all around. There were other tents set up, people talking quietly around the fire. It felt safe, normal again. We spent the rest of the night at their campsite. We ate, we drank hot chocolate, we talked about normal things, trying to push what happened on the trail to the back of our minds. The kids were quiet, still shaken, but they seemed to relax a bit in the warmth of the firelight, surrounded by other people. Sarah and her friends were amazing. They were so kind, so understanding. They didn't make us feel like we were crazy, even though I'm sure some of them must have thought we were overreacting. But they took us seriously. They made us feel safe. We stayed with them for the rest of the weekend. We didn't go back to Morgana Trail. We didn't go hiking again, period. We mostly just stayed around the campsite, trying to enjoy the rest of our weekend, trying to forget the fear in the woods. But we haven't forgotten. We still talk about it sometimes, years later. What was it? What did Jess and Kevin see? What made those wood knocks? Was it just some weird coincidence, or was there something else out there watching us in the woods that day? I still don't know. And honestly, I don't think I ever will. But I'll never forget the feeling, that cold, creeping fear when those wood knocks started echoing through the trees surrounding us. The feeling of being watched, of being hunted by something we couldn't see, couldn't understand. It's something that sticks with you, something you can't really shake off. And every time I go into the woods now, even for just a short walk, I can't help but listen, waiting for that sound again. Crack. Just like that. And I swear sometimes, when the wind rustles through the trees just right, or when a branch snaps, I almost hear it again, and that cold dread comes back, just for a second. Just enough to remind me of that day, on Morgana Trail, in Shadow Creek. And the thing in the woods that watched us, and knocked on the trees, and then just vanished. Story 10. We were heading back from my mum's place in Harrisonburg. Lily, my 12-year-old, was glued to her tablet, headphones blasting some kids' pop music. October afternoon, Virginia, you know the vibe. Overcast, that kind of damp chill that gets right into your bones. Route 34, that stretch between Oakhaven and Willow Bend. Pure woods, like dense, thick woods closing in on both sides of the road. You barely see houses, just trees and shadows, even when it's not that late. I was just driving, you know, on autopilot. Windows up because of the damp heater humming quietly. Then something flickered up on the hillside to my right. Just a movement, high up, through the trees. My first thought, honest to God, was deer. We see deer all the time out here. Or maybe a big dog wandered off from somewhere, but it was moving. Wrong. Not like a deer. Too bulky, too low to the ground for how big it seemed. And fast, really fast. It was tearing through the underbrush like something was chasing it, or like it was chasing something. I slowed down a little, just naturally curious, squinting up the slope. That's when it broke through a gap in the trees, closer to the road now. And I knew right away, instantly, that wasn't a deer, wasn't any dog neither. It was dark, shadowy almost, even in the grey light, and big, thicker than a deer, wider with this weird hunched shape. It was still kind of far off, but I could see it was moving downhill at an angle towards the road. And it wasn't running like a normal four-legged animal. It was like loping, like its front legs were longer, way longer than its back legs, almost like it was using its front legs more like arms. Lily, oblivious still with her music, thank God. I kept watching it, my heart starting to pick up speed. As it got closer to the edge of the woods, where the trees thinned out before the fence line along the road, that's when I got a real look at it. And that's when things went sideways, man. Seriously sideways. It burst through the last of the trees, and it cleared that fence, a proper farm fence, you know, those wooden posts with wire mesh. It cleared it in one freaking jump, like it wasn't even there. Landed on the other side, still moving, still coming towards the road. And it was grotesque. That's the only word for it. It wasn't like anything alive should look. It was low to the ground, but when it stood kinda uprightish on all fours, it was still big. And it was covered in hair, fur, but dark, matted-looking, almost oily, like something that lived in the dirt. But the worst part, the part that made my blood run cold, was its head. It was round, just round and dark, sitting right on top of its thick shoulders, no neck to speak of, and there was nothing sticking out, no snout, no muzzle, no nose like you'd expect, just smooth, round and smooth and dark. Lily finally took her headphones off, probably because she felt the car slowing down or something. "Mum, what's wrong?" she asked, all whiny teenager-like. I couldn't even answer her at first. I just pointed, out the windshield, towards it. It was closer now, way closer, only a few yards from the edge of the road. And it wasn't just dark and hairy and hunched. It was defined, in a horrible way. I saw its face then, if you could even call it that. It was like a disc, a flat, dark disc. And in the middle of that disc, there were two holes, black holes, where its eyes should have been maybe, but no eyeballs, just holes, empty and black, and above them, barely visible, just creases in the skin really, like shallow arcs, almost like eyebrow ridges, but barely there. And its mouth, there wasn't one, not like a mouth you'd recognize, just another slit. A horizontal slit low down on that round face, maybe below where a nose should be if it had a nose, just a dark, lipless slit. It was like someone had taken a face and just erased all the features except for the holes in the slit. Lily saw it then, and she screamed, not a normal scream, you know, it was like a trapped animal scream, high-pitched and desperate and raw. She pointed right at it, her finger shaking. "What is that?" she yelled, voice cracking. And then I saw its hands, because it put its front legs down as it crossed the little ditch alongside the road. And they weren't paws, they weren't hooves, they were hands, like human hands. But wrong. Too big, too long, the fingers too skinny, the skin dark and leathery. And they had nails, claws, long and curved and dark. It used those hands to push itself up, to kind of scramble across the ditch bank and onto the edge of the asphalt. And it was then, right then, when it was practically at the roadside, that it turned its head thing towards us. Or at least I think it turned towards us. Those black holes, those empty eye holes, seemed to fix on the car, on us. And it smelled. God, the smell, like rotten meat and wet fur and dirt. A thick, cloying, disgusting smell that filled the car instantly. Even with the windows up and the heater running, it was like death and decay, all mixed together in one horrible stench. I slammed on the brakes, hard. The tires screeched on the road, and the car lurched to a stop. We were practically nose to nose with it. It was right there, maybe 10, 15 feet away, just standing at the side of the road, its round head turned towards us, those black holes, looking at us. Time just stopped. Everything went silent except for Lily's panicked breathing next to me and the low, wet sounds it was making. Grunts, maybe? Snuffling? Hard to describe. Like it was trying to breathe through that slit mouth, and it was all wet and gurgling. It stood there for what felt like forever, but it was probably only seconds. Just watching. And I was frozen. My foot was clamped on the brake pedal, my hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel, and I couldn't breathe. Couldn't even scream, just stared back at that thing. Lily was whimpering now, burying her face in her hands, but still peeking out between her fingers. "Mommy, what is it? What is it?" she kept whispering, voice choked with tears. And then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it moved, not at us, away. It turned that round head away, and it stepped out onto the road. 2 steps, that's all it took. 2 long, clumsy, shambling steps, and it was across the road. And then it was gone. It just vanished, into the trees on the other side, like it just melted into the shadows. 1 minute it was there, that grotesque, horrifying creature right in front of us. The next minute, nothing, just empty road, just woods, and the smell. That awful lingering stench hanging in the air even inside the car. We just sat there, staring at the spot where it had disappeared, neither of us moving, neither of us speaking, just numb, shocked, terrified. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, hammering like a drum. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely grip the steering wheel. The silence of the woods was different now. It wasn't just peaceful country silence. It was heavy, oppressive, like it was watching us, like there were eyes in those trees now, and they were all on us. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like we were trespassing somewhere we shouldn't be. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a couple of minutes, maybe less, Lily finally spoke. Her voice was small and shaky. "Mom, did you see that?" I just nodded. Couldn't talk yet. My throat felt like it was clamped shut. What was it?" she asked again, still whispering. I shook my head. I don't know, baby. I honestly don't know." And that's the truth. I didn't know then, and I don't know now. I've tried to make sense of it, to rationalize it. Maybe it was a bear, but bears don't look like that, and they don't move like that, and they definitely don't smell like that. And those hands, those human-like hands, no, it wasn't a bear. It wasn't any animal I've ever seen or heard of. We were still stopped in the middle of Route 34. Cars could come around the bend any minute. I knew we had to move, but I didn't want to. I wanted to stay there, frozen, like if we didn't move, it couldn't get us. Stupid, I know, but I couldn't stay there forever. I took a shaky breath, gripped the steering wheel tighter, and put the car in drive. Slowly, so slowly, I started to pull away. My eyes were glued to the rearview mirror, watching the woods on the other side of the road, expecting something, anything, to jump out, to follow us. Nothing did, just trees, shadows, and that awful heavy silence. But I could still smell it, that stench. It was faint now, but it was still there, clinging to the inside of the car, and in my nose, and in my head. I didn't drive home normally, I'll tell you that. I pressed that gas pedal down and I didn't let up. 60, 70, 75, faster than I ever drive on those back roads. Lily was still quiet next to me, just staring straight ahead, pale as a ghost. I don't think she'd taken her eyes off the road since it. We got home finally. Meadow Creek felt like 1,000,000 miles away from Route 34. I pulled into the driveway, turned off the engine, and just sat there for another minute, still shaking. Lily just unbuckled her seatbelt and bolted for the house, didn't say a word, slammed the door behind her. I sat there for a little longer, trying to get my breath back, trying to make my heart slow down. The smell was starting to fade inside the car, thank God. But the image was burned into my brain, that round, featureless head. Those black, empty holes, those long, grasping hands. I went inside, and Lily was already upstairs in her room. I didn't push it, just went into the kitchen, made myself a stiff drink, and tried to pretend it hadn't happened, like it was just a hallucination, stress, bad lighting, anything. But it wasn't. It was real. I know what I saw. We both did. And it changed things, man. It really did. Now, driving anywhere out in the country, it's different. Every shadow looks wrong. Every rustle in the leaves makes me jump. I can't drive down Route 34 anymore. Not that stretch anyway. I take the long way around now, even if it adds time. I can't go back there. And at night? Nights are worse. Every little sound outside, the wind in the trees, an owl hooting, even the crickets. It all sounds different now, like it's something else, something listening, watching. Sometimes when I can't sleep, I think about it, and I wonder, what was it? Where did it come from? Where did it go? Was it just passing through? Or was it watching us before we even saw it? Waiting for us? And the worst part? The part that keeps me up at night? Is that image, that head turning, those black holes, fixing on us, like it knew us, like it saw something inside us, something it wanted. And I still can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, somewhere in those woods, watching, waiting. I don't know what it was. I wish to God I did, but I don't, and I don't think I ever will. And that's the scariest part of all. Story 11. It was one of those crisp fall afternoons, the kind that Pennsylvania does so well. Leaves were turning, air was sharp and smelled like wood smoke, even though no one nearby was burning anything. Sunlight was cutting through the trees in stripes, making everything dappled. My two kids, Leo and Maya, were with me. Leo was just 2, all chubby cheeks and grabbing hands, bouncing on my hip in a carrier thing. Maya, 6 years old, and already acting like she was 16, was walking next to me, kicking at loose leaves, making that satisfying, crunchy sound. We were behind our house, deeper into the woods than usual. It's not like we're talking wilderness, but enough woods to get properly lost if you weren't paying attention. We back onto state land, just scrubby forest that goes on for miles, all rolling hills and thick trees. I'd been finding these weird tracks near the usual trails for months, too big for deer, not really like bear prints either, more like elongated, skinny but big, and they were always kind of off the beaten path, deeper in. Curiosity, I guess, that's what got me this time. I know, dumb, mom with 2 little kids going off trail because of weird footprints. But the day was so peaceful, kids were behaving, and it felt like a little adventure, you know? We were following what looked like a faint deer trail, but even that started fading. It got quieter too, deeper in. The normal wood sounds, the birds chattering, the squirrels rustling in the leaves, it all seemed to dim. Just the crunch of Maya's boots and my own, and Leo humming to himself, happy as could be. I was looking down, trying to see if I could spot any more of those prints when I heard it. Just a snap, like a dry twig breaking underfoot, sharp and sudden in the quiet. My head jerked up, instant instinct like something hardwired. I scanned the trees, naturally looking for deer or maybe a fox, something normal. And that's when I saw it, about 100 yards away, maybe a bit less, through the bare branches of the oaks and maples. It was dark, solid black against the brown and grey of the woods, tall, so damn tall. I initially thought it was a person, just someone in dark clothes, maybe a hunter way off track. But as I focused, my stomach dropped. It wasn't walking. It was moving, like gliding, like it was floating just above the ground, just sliding through the trees. No up and down motion, no stride, just this smooth, impossibly fast movement. And it wasn't dressed in clothes, not that I could see. It was just darkness, shaped like a person, but like a shadow person. No details, just tall and black and moving way too fast and way too silently through the woods, like it wasn't even touching the leaves on the ground. My brain short-circuited for a second, just pure, unfiltered panic. Not like the jump scare kind of fear, more like primal terror, the kind that hits you in the gut and freezes your blood. I've never felt anything like it before. It was like looking at something that shouldn't exist, something fundamentally wrong, Heart started hammering so hard I could feel it in my ears. Breath hitched in my throat. My hands went clammy, instantly cold. I didn't think, didn't analyze, just acted. Grabbed Leo tighter, so tight he gave a little squawk and wiggled against me. Scooped Maya up in my other arm. She was heavier than she looked, always is, and just turned and ran. Ran like hell. Didn't even think about being quiet, just crashing through the underbrush, branches snapping, leaves flying. I could hear Maya gasp in surprise, then start yelling, "Mommy, Mommy, what is it?" But I couldn't answer, couldn't even breathe properly, lungs burning, legs pumping, just ran. I kept glancing back over my shoulder, terrified it would be right behind me. But all I saw was trees, and more trees, the stripes of sunlight flashing past. Each time I looked back, expecting to see it and didn't, the fear just ratcheted up another notch. Because what was that thing? And where was it now? Was it still coming? Was it faster than me? The trees thinned out eventually, broke into the field behind our house. Open space. Thank God for open space. I didn't stop running until I was practically at the back door, stumbling onto the porch, nearly dropping Maya and Leo in my rush to get inside. Slammed the door behind me, bolted it, and just stood there, panting, leaning against the wood, heart still going like a jackhammer. Kids were crying. Maya was clinging to my leg. Leo was wailing because I'd jostled him around so much. But I couldn't even focus on them for a few minutes, just stood there listening. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside sounded like it coming closer. It took a good 10 minutes for my hands to stop shaking enough to make a cup of tea. I got the kids calmed down, distracted them with cartoons and crackers. Then finally, I sat at the kitchen table, tea untouched in front of me, and tried to make sense of what I'd seen, tried to rationalize it away. Shadows, tricks of the light, maybe a really tall, skinny deer, but none of it fit. Deer don't move like that. Deer don't look like that absence of light. And the speed, the absolute silence of its movement. No rustle of leaves, no snap of twigs as it moved. Just gliding darkness. David got home from work a few hours later. I waited until the kids were in bed before I told him. I didn't want to scare them more. I still felt shaky just talking about it, voice trembling a little, even though I tried to sound calm. He listened, of course, because he always does, but I could see the skepticism in his eyes, the slight roll when I described it as gliding. He's a practical guy, David. Engineer. Sees the world in black and white, facts and figures. He loves me, I know he does, and he worries when I'm upset. But monsters in the woods, shadow people, that's not his world. He suggested it was probably just a bear, moving quickly, maybe partially obscured by trees, making it look weird. Or, I just imagined it, was stressed, tired, mom brain. He didn't say it condescendingly, not exactly, but it was there, in the undertone. He wasn't dismissing me outright, just looking for a logical explanation. I tried to explain again about the movement, the speed, the sheer wrongness of it. The feeling of dread it gave me, how it didn't feel like anything normal. But words just felt inadequate. How do you describe terror that comes from something you can't even define? He could see how genuinely freaked out I was, though. He's not blind. He saw my face. He heard the wobble in my voice. And that, I think, is what made him agree to go back with me. Not because he believed me, not really, but because he knew something had scared me. Something real to me. Okay, he said finally, sighing, running a hand through his hair. Okay, we'll go look. Tomorrow, if you want. We'll go see what scared you. Maybe we'll find something, maybe we won't. But we'll go together. 2 days later, it was the first day he had free. We went. Kids were at daycare. It was another sunny day, almost too bright after the shadows of the woods. I was nervous, really nervous. Even with David beside me, solid and dependable, 6'2", and built like a brick outhouse. Knowing he was there was a comfort, a big one. But the fear was still humming under my skin, like a low-frequency vibration you can feel more than hear. We walked out back, into the woods. I led the way, retracing my steps from that day. The place where I'd seen it was deeper in than we usually went. It looked different in the bright daylight, less menacing. But the feeling was still there, a heavy, watchful silence hanging in the air. I pointed to the spot, told him where I'd been, where I'd seen it. David just nodded, his face serious. He didn't say anything, just started looking around, examining the ground, scanning the trees. He was thorough, I'll give him that. He took it seriously, even if he thought I was being irrational. We walked in the direction I'd seen it moving, deeper into the woods, just looking. For tracks, for anything, for proof that I hadn't completely lost it. We walked for maybe half an hour, pushing through brush, stepping over fallen logs. David was quiet, just the crunch of our boots on the leaves. I was jumpy, every rustle of leaves making me flinch. And then we found it. Or rather, it found us. I tripped, just stumbled over a root or something hidden under the leaves, went down hard, catching myself on my hands. David stopped, reached down to help me up. "You okay?" "Yeah, just clumsy," I muttered, dusting off my jeans. But as I stood up, I saw it. Hidden back in a thicket of mountain laurel, almost completely concealed. A structure, a crude hut, built of branches and sticks and woven with vines. It wasn't obvious at first. It was the shape more than anything that caught my eye. A rough, rounded dome, sort of hunched over, camouflaged almost perfectly with the surrounding woods. If I hadn't stumbled, if we'd been looking up instead of down, we probably would have walked right past it. We pushed through the laurel branches, David leading the way this time. The closer we got, the clearer it became. It was a hut, no doubt about it. But not like a kid's fort. This was bigger, more substantial. It was maybe 6 feet tall at the peak, maybe 8 or 10 feet across. A framework of thicker branches, lashed together with vines and what looked like strips of bark. The spaces between the branches were filled in with smaller sticks, leaves, mud, anything that would fill a gap. Crude, yes, but definitely built with intention, built to last and to hide. We circled it slowly, taking it in. No door, just a low, dark opening on one side, just big enough to crawl into. It smelled damp and earthy, faintly animal, not rotten but musky, wild. David frowned, running a hand over the rough wall of the hut. "Kids?" he said doubtfully. I shook my head. "No way. Too big, too well built. And who'd build something way out here, hidden like this?" He pushed aside some more branches, peering into the opening. It was dark inside, shadowy. I couldn't see anything clearly, just darkness and the vague outline of the interior. "Hello?" David called out, his voice echoing strangely in the still woods. Silence, just the rustle of leaves in the breeze. He called again, louder. "Anyone in there?" Nothing. Absolute silence. He hesitated for a moment, then crouched down and ducked into the opening. My heart jumped into my throat. "David, wait!" I hissed, but he was already inside. I stood there, frozen, watching the dark opening, listening, every nerve ending screaming. It felt like forever, but it was probably only seconds. Then David backed out of the hut, his face pale, his eyes wide. He stood up slowly, brushing leaves and dirt off his clothes. "Anything?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He just shook his head, his eyes still unfocused, like he was seeing something that wasn't there anymore. Or maybe something that was still there, inside his head. "Nothing," he said finally, his voice low and rough. "Just dirt, leaves, smells, weird." He wouldn't meet my eyes. He kept looking back at the hut, that dark, silent opening like a mouth in the shadows. We stood there for another minute, both of us staring at the hut, at each other. The silence of the woods seemed to press in on us, heavy and watchful. The sunlight didn't seem so bright anymore. The air felt colder. Let's go," David said finally, turning away abruptly. His voice was still tight. He didn't wait for me, just started walking quickly back in the direction we'd come from. I followed him, my mind racing. What had he seen in there? Why was he so freaked out? He's not easily rattled, not at all. We walked back to the house in silence. A strained, heavy silence, nothing like the comfortable quiet we usually shared. We went inside, locked the door. He went straight to the liquor cabinet, poured himself a stiff drink, and drank it down in one gulp. He never does that. Not ever. He poured another, then finally turned to me. His face was still pale, still shaken. "We're not going back there, Portia," he said, his voice flat, decisive. "Not ever, you hear me?" I nodded numbly. "What was it, David? What did you see?" He looked at me, his eyes dark, filled with something I'd never seen before. Not fear, exactly. More like something beyond fear. Something deeper, colder. "I don't know," he said. His voice was barely above a whisper. "And I don't want to know." And that was it. He wouldn't say another word about it. Wouldn't go near the woods behind the house anymore. He even started checking the locks on the doors and windows every night, something he'd never done before. We never went back to the woods together. I haven't been back there alone since either. And I still can't shake the image of that dark figure gliding through the trees, or the feeling of dread that settled over me when we found that hut. Sometimes at night, I wake up and listen. Just listen to the sounds outside, the wind in the trees, the crickets chirping. And sometimes, in the back of my mind, I think I hear something else, something silent, moving through the woods. And I wonder what's out there, and what it wants, and if it's still watching, and if maybe, just maybe, it's watching right now. I don't know what we saw in the woods that day. I don't know who or what built that hut. And I really, truly don't want to know. Some questions are better left unanswered, I think. Some things are better left in the dark, back in the shadows of the woods where they belong. And I just pray every day that whatever it was, it stays there and never, ever comes closer to our house again. Because the fear, that bone-deep, chilling fear, is something I never want to feel again. Never. Story 12. Now, Parsons Road, it's not exactly a highway. It's more like a back road, the kind you take when you want to avoid the traffic on Route 414. It cuts right through the woods, and most of the time, especially at night, you don't see another car for miles. It's usually peaceful, quiet. Sometimes you see deer crossing, or maybe a raccoon. That's about the extent of excitement on Parsons Road. We've driven it countless times, day and night. Never thought twice about it. That night, though, it was different. It was maybe around 10:30, something like that. The air had that late autumn chill, the kind that bites through your jacket if you're not careful. The leaves were mostly down by then, but there were still some clinging to the branches, rattling a bit in the breeze. It was a clear night, sky full of stars, but down on Parsons Road, under the trees, it was pitch black. Just our headlights cutting through the dark. Helen was in the passenger seat, quiet, looking out the window. She gets tired easily these days. I was just driving, thinking about getting home, getting a cup of coffee, maybe watching a bit of TV before bed. Normal stuff. We were talking a bit about Hemlock's stories, actually, and we both were kind of chuckling about one where he swore he saw a bear riding a bicycle. Total nonsense. The old guy's got a wild imagination. We were coming up on that sharp bend, the one right before the old Peterson place, where the road curves real tight to the left. I slowed down, like always. You can't take that corner fast unless you want to end up in a ditch. As we rounded the bend, that's when it happened. My headlights caught something moving in the side of the road. It was quick, just a flash of movement, but enough to make me snap my head towards it. And then it stepped out onto the road. I don't know what I was expecting to see. Deer maybe, like I said, happens all the time. But this wasn't a deer. It was big, massive. It was crossing the road from the right, coming out of the trees, and it was moving fast. It was low to the ground on 4 legs, but it was like nothing I've ever seen on 4 legs before. Not a cow, not a horse, definitely not a deer or a bear. It was just wrong. It was dark, darker than the shadows under the trees, almost like it absorbed the light from my headlights. But I could see it was covered in fur, long, shaggy black fur. It wasn't smooth like a dog's fur. It was thick and wild-looking, and it was huge, taller than a deer, much wider, just bulky. I can't even really describe the size. It was like distorted. It moved in this strange way, not like a run, more like a powerful glide. It was low, close to the ground, but it covered ground so fast. My brain just couldn't process it. I slammed on the brakes. The tires screeched, that horrible, loud, screeching sound in the quiet night, and the truck skidded a bit. Helen gasped beside me, grabbed onto the dashboard. "Don, what the—" I couldn't take my eyes off this thing. It was right in front of us now, just a few feet from the hood of the truck. It kept moving, crossing the road without even looking at us, like we weren't there. I got maybe a second, maybe 2, to really see it in the headlights. And what I saw, it's burned into my mind. It had a head, yeah, but it was weirdly shaped, longer than it should be, kind of pointed and low to the ground. I didn't see any eyes reflecting in the headlights, just darkness. The fur was so thick around its head and neck, it was hard to make out details. But the size of it, and the way it moved, it was just monstrous. And then it was across the road, at the edge of the trees on the other side. It didn't stop, didn't hesitate. It just went straight into the woods and disappeared, just like that. 1 second it was there, this massive, terrifying shape in front of my truck, and the next, gone, swallowed up by the darkness of the trees. My heart was pounding in my chest, like it wanted to burst out of my ribs. I was breathing hard, felt sweat prickling on my forehead even though it was cold. Helen was just staring straight ahead, pale as a ghost. "Don, what was that?" Her voice was barely a whisper. It was shaky, scared. I didn't know what to say. What could I say? I don't know, Helen. I honestly don't know. "It wasn't a deer," she said, her voice still trembling. "It was too big and dark. It was wrong." Wrong. That's exactly the word for it. It felt fundamentally wrong. Like something that shouldn't exist, shouldn't be out there in the woods on Parson's Road at night. "Don, don't stop," Helen said suddenly, her voice sharper now, laced with panic. "Please just drive. Let's just go home." She was looking at the woods where the thing had disappeared, her eyes wide with fear. I could see it in her face. She was terrified, and honestly, so was I. I didn't want to stop. I didn't want to stay there for another second. The thought of that thing still being out there in the darkness, watching us, it made my skin crawl. I took my foot off the brake, put the truck back in drive, and put my foot down on the gas. The tires spun for a second on the gravel, then we lurched forward. I didn't floor it, but I definitely sped up faster than usual. I just wanted to get away from that place, from that feeling, from whatever that thing was. I kept driving, faster than I probably should have been on Parson's Road, glancing in the rearview mirror every few seconds, just seeing the darkness behind us, the trees rushing past in the headlights. I was looking for— I don't know what I was looking for. Some sign of movement, some reflection of eyes, anything to show that it was still there, maybe following us. But there was nothing, just darkness and the trees, and silence. A heavy, oppressive silence. Even the usual night sounds, the crickets, the rustling leaves, it all seemed to have gone quiet, like everything was holding its breath. We drove the rest of Parson's Road like that, tense and silent. Helen didn't say anything else, just stared straight ahead, gripping her seatbelt tight. I could feel her fear radiating off her, and it just fed into my own. Every shadow seemed to move. Every rustle of leaves made me jump. My heart didn't slow down for the rest of the drive. I kept thinking about what we had seen, trying to make sense of it, but my mind just kept drawing a blank. There was no animal I could compare it to, no explanation that fit. We finally got to the turn off Parsons Road onto County Road 124. As soon as we were on the wider road, I felt a tiny bit of relief. It was still dark, still rural, but somehow, being on a bigger road, even if it was just a county road, made it feel a little safer, a little less isolated. We drove the rest of the way home in silence. When we pulled into the driveway, I switched off the engine and just sat there for a minute, catching my breath. Helen finally let out a long, shaky exhale. "I'm glad to be home," she said softly. "Me too," I replied, and it was the understatement of the year. We got out of the truck and hurried inside. We locked the door, double-checked the deadbolt, like locking the door would keep whatever we saw on Parsons Road out. It probably wouldn't, but it made us feel a little better at least. We went into the kitchen, and I automatically started making coffee. It's what we always do when we get home late. The smell of the coffee brewing usually calms me down, grounds me. But tonight, even the coffee couldn't shake off the chill that had settled over me. We sat at the kitchen table drinking our coffee in silence. The only sound was the ticking of the kitchen clock, loud in the stillness of the house. I looked at Helen. She looked exhausted and still scared. "What do you think it was?" she finally asked, her voice still quiet. I shook my head. "I have no idea, Helen. Honestly, I've hunted in these woods my whole life. I've seen all kinds of animals, big and small. I've never seen anything like that, ever." Maybe it was just a bear," she suggested, but even she didn't sound convinced. "No," I said firmly. "It wasn't a bear. Bears are big, yeah, but they're not that. And they don't move like that. This thing, it was different. It was wrong." We sat there for a long time, talking in low voices, trying to make sense of it, trying to find some rational explanation. But there wasn't one. Every animal we could think of, it didn't fit. The size, the shape, the way it moved, the darkness of it, it was all just off. We went to bed eventually, but I didn't sleep well. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that dark shape crossing the road in front of my truck. I saw the long, shaggy fur, the weirdly shaped head, the way it disappeared into the darkness. I kept replaying it in my mind, over and over again, trying to catch some detail I might have missed, some clue that would make sense of it. But there was nothing, just the fear, the confusion, and the unsettling feeling that we had seen something we weren't supposed to see, something that shouldn't be out there. The next day, it was daylight, bright sunshine. The world looked normal again. We went about our day, doing chores around the farm, trying to pretend that last night hadn't happened. But it was always there, hanging over us. We talked about it a few more times, hesitantly, trying to rationalize it away, tell ourselves it was just our imaginations, the darkness playing tricks on our eyes. But deep down, we both knew it wasn't. We both knew we had seen something real, something unnatural. We haven't driven down Parsons Road at night since then. Not even during the day, really, if we can avoid it. We take the longer way around now, even if it takes more time, just to stay off that stretch of road. It's silly, maybe, but I can't shake the feeling when I think about Parsons Road after dark. That feeling of dread, of something lurking in the shadows. And sometimes late at night, when everything is quiet and dark, I think about that thing again. I see it in my mind, that massive dark shape moving silently through the trees, and I wonder, what was it, and is it still out there, waiting in the darkness of Parsons Road? I know it sounds crazy. I know people will probably say we just saw a large dog, or a coyote, or something else, and our minds just exaggerated it in the dark. Maybe. But I know what I saw, and Helen knows what she saw. And it wasn't any animal we've ever seen before. It was something else, something I still can't put into words, and that's the thing that gets to me the most. The not knowing, the uncertainty, the feeling that there are things out there, hidden in the woods, in the darkness, that we don't understand. Things that maybe we're not meant to understand. And sometimes, when the wind blows through the trees at night, and I hear the rustling of leaves in the dark, I swear, I can almost hear it moving out there, still waiting, and I get that same cold chill, that same fear in my gut, like I did that night on Parson's Road. And I just hope I never see it again. Ever. Story 13. Look, I'm not usually one to put my business out there, especially not something like this. It's been years, but sometimes it just comes back, you know? Like a bad taste in your mouth, or that feeling when you step on a stair that isn't there and your stomach drops. That's what it's like. We had this property up in Ashland County, Wisconsin. Bought it back in the late 90s. Figured it'd be perfect for hunting, camping, just getting away from it all. It was rough land, mostly woods, a little creek running through it. The kind of place where you could really feel like you were alone. And for a long time, that's exactly what it was. Peace and quiet. That's what I loved about it. I used to go up there all the time, sometimes with my son, sometimes with friends, sometimes just me and the dog. It was my spot, my escape. But things started to change. Not all at once, more like a feeling creeping in, a kind of unease. Hard to explain, you know? Like when you're in a room and you know someone's staring at you, but you turn around and nobody is there. Just this prickling feeling on the back of your neck. It started subtle little things, feeling like I was being watched when I knew there shouldn't be anyone around. Hearing branches snap when there was no wind, stuff you could explain away easily. Must be deer, I'd tell myself, just the wind playing tricks. But it kept happening, and that feeling, it just wouldn't go away. Then came that night by the creek. It was late summer, maybe early fall. Weather was still good enough for camping. I took my boy, Timmy, and his friend, Mark. They were maybe 10, 12 years old then, excited to be out in the woods, roughing it as they called it. We set up camp by the creek like always. Felt good to be there. Started a fire, cooked some hot dogs, told stories. Regular camping stuff. Kids were happy, I was relaxed. The sun went down, stars started popping out. It was a really dark night. No moon, just stars. Thick woods all around. Perfect for getting away from city lights. We put out the fire before heading to the tents. The kids were in one tent, I was in the other, just a few feet away. I was drifting off, you know, that comfortable tiredness you get after being outside all day. The woods at night are usually pretty loud with nature sounds, but it's a familiar noise, a comforting noise. Crickets chirping, maybe an owl hooting way off, rustling leaves, the creek gurgling along. White noise almost, helps you sleep. But then, it started. This sound. I can still hear it in my head, clear as day. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. It was chattering, but not like squirrels or birds, nothing natural. Lower pitched, almost guttural, like it was coming from deep in the throat. And weirdly rhythmic, like words almost, but not words I could understand. Just chattering. Low, constant. And it seemed to be coming from the trees just beyond our campsite. I sat up in my sleeping bag. At first, I thought it was just the kids messing around, even though it didn't sound like them at all. "Timmy? Mark!" I called out quietly, sticking my head out of the tent flap. Silence, except for the chattering. It was still there, maybe even a little louder now. It was definitely coming from outside, from the woods, from the dark. I unzipped the tent a little more and listened. The creek was still burbling, the crickets were still going, but this chattering sound, it was weaving itself in and out of everything else, making everything feel different, wrong somehow. It felt intrusive, like something that shouldn't be there, that didn't belong. I'm a hunter. I've spent my life in the woods. I know animal sounds, deer grunts, coyote howls, fox barks, even bear noises if you get unlucky. I've heard it all. But this was nothing I recognized, and it wasn't just coming from one place. It seemed to be all around us, shifting, moving, echoing off the trees, like there were multiple things making the sound, and they were moving through the woods. That prickling feeling on the back of my neck came back, but 10 times stronger. My heart started to thump a little harder in my chest. I reached for my flashlight, the big mag light I always kept beside my sleeping bag, clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, bouncing off the trees right outside the camp. Nothing, just trees, shadows moving in the breeze. I stepped out of the tent. The night was pitch black. No moon, just a faint scattering of stars way up above the canopy. It was the kind of darkness that feels heavy, like it's pressing down on you. The air was still, but cold, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones. And the chattering, it was definitely louder now that I was outside, seemed closer too, like it was encircling us. I walked a few feet away from the tents, shining the flashlight into the woods. Still nothing, just trees, undergrowth, shadows. But the chattering kept coming, from all directions. It was hard to pinpoint exactly where it was coming from, like trying to locate a sound in a deep cave. It just seemed to bounce around, to be everywhere and nowhere at once. "Hello!" I called out, my voice sounding weak and shaky even to my own ears. "Is anyone out there?" Silence. For a second, the chattering stopped. Just the creek and the crickets again. Then, it started again. Closer this time, I thought. Definitely closer. It sounded like it was maybe 50 yards away, just beyond the tree line. My hand tightened on the flashlight. I felt a knot forming in my stomach. This wasn't right. This wasn't just some animal. Something about the way the sound moved, the way it shifted and echoed, the way it seemed to respond to me calling out. It felt intelligent, like something was out there, listening, watching. I went back to my tent, quickly, but trying to not look like I was running, grabbed my rifle, the old .30-30 I always brought camping, loaded it, checked the safety. Not that I was planning on shooting anything, but just having it in my hands made me feel a little better, a little less vulnerable. Went back out of the tent. The kids were still asleep, or at least quiet in their tent. I didn't want to wake them, didn't want to scare them, but I couldn't just ignore this. Something was happening. Something felt deeply, fundamentally wrong. The chattering continued, and now there was something else. A new sound starting to mix in with the chattering, a thumping, dull, heavy thumps, like someone was hitting the trees. Not with an axe, more like with their fists. Slow, deliberate thumps. Thump, thump, thump. Accompanied by the constant unsettling chattering, my blood ran cold, thumps against the trees, and that weird, unearthly chattering. What the hell was making those sounds? Deer don't thump trees, bears don't chatter. Nothing I knew about made sounds like that. I started to move, slowly, carefully, rifle in hand, flashlight beams sweeping through the woods. I was trying to be quiet, but my boots crunched on the leaves and twigs on the ground. Every step felt loud, too loud in the stillness of the night, swallowed up by the darkness and that incessant chattering and thumping. I moved towards the direction where I thought the thumping was coming from, deeper into the woods, away from the campsite. The trees were thick here, the undergrowth tangled. The flashlight beam only went so far, swallowed up by the shadows. Everything beyond the beam was black, an impenetrable wall of darkness. Then I heard it, right in front of me, a sharp crack, like stone cracking, a loud, sudden crack that echoed through the woods, silencing even the crickets for a moment, and then more cracking, smaller, softer cracks, like gravel shifting underfoot or stones being broken. My breath hitched in my throat. Cracking stones, thumping trees, chattering that sounded almost like words but wasn't, in the middle of the Wisconsin woods, in the dead of night, miles from anywhere. What was going on? I stopped moving, just stood there, rifle raised, flashlight shaking slightly in my hand, heart pounding in my chest like a drum. I was scared, truly scared, not just the jump scare kind of scared, but deep, bone-chilling fear. The kind of fear that makes your hair stand on end, that makes your skin crawl. The kind of fear that tells you deep down in your gut that you are in danger, real danger. The sounds continued, chattering, thumping, stone cracking, moving around me closer now. I was sure of it. I could almost feel them, feel something out there in the dark, circling me, watching me. I slowly backed away, keeping the flashlight pointed forward, rifle still raised. Backing towards the campsite, towards the tents, towards my son and his friend. I needed to get them out of here. Now. This wasn't right. This was way beyond anything normal. I got back to the tents. Timmy's tent was still quiet. I hesitated for a moment, thinking about waking them, thinking about telling them what was happening. But what would I say? Hey kids, wake up. There's something weird out there making creepy noises and I think we need to run. They'd be terrified. And honestly, I didn't know what we were running from. I didn't know what it was. I decided against waking them. Not yet, anyway. I'd stay up, keep watch, see what happened. Maybe it would go away. Maybe it was just some kind of weird animal I didn't know about. Maybe it would get bored and leave. I spent the rest of the night like that, standing outside the tents, rifle in hand, flashlight sweeping the woods, listening. The chattering and thumping and cracking continued off and on, sometimes louder, sometimes softer, but always there, always circling. It never stopped completely until just before dawn. I didn't sleep a wink. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, every hoot of an owl made me jump. I was on edge, wired tight with fear. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like we were being surrounded by something unseen, something malevolent. As the first hint of light started to creep into the sky, the sounds finally faded away. Slowly, gradually, they just stopped. The woods went quiet again, except for the normal morning sounds. Birds starting to chirp, squirrels chattering, the normal kind finally. The creek still burbling. It was almost like nothing had happened, almost like I'd imagined it all. But I knew I hadn't. I knew what I'd heard, what I'd felt, that raw, primal fear. It was real, and it wasn't just me. I could see it in the way the woods felt different now, changed somehow, like something had violated them. Something dark and unnatural had been there. As soon as it was light enough, I packed everything up, quickly, silently, efficiently, didn't even bother with breakfast, just stuffed everything back into the truck. Woke the kids up, told them we were leaving. They were groggy and confused, but they didn't argue. They could probably sense something was off too, even if they hadn't heard the sounds as clearly as I had. We got out of there, drove back home in silence. The kids were quiet, looking out the windows. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror as if I expected to see something following us out of the woods. But there was nothing, just the trees, the road, the rising sun. We never went back to that property after that. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, stress, something natural I'd misidentified. But I couldn't shake the feeling, that deep, gnawing unease that something was wrong there. Something beyond my understanding, something dangerous. Years went by. We sold the property a few years later. I tried to forget about that night, tried to put it out of my mind. But every now and then, it would come back. Especially when I was in the woods at night, camping or hunting, that feeling of being watched, the rustling leaves, the shadows, it would all bring it back. Then, a couple of years ago, I was flipping through channels late one night, couldn't sleep. Stumbled across some kind of show, one of those paranormal investigation things. Aliens, ghosts, cryptids, you know the kind. I was about to change the channel when I heard it. On the TV, coming out of the speakers, they were playing recordings of sounds, unexplained phenomena, the narrator was saying. Mysterious sounds captured in remote wilderness areas. And then they played it. That sound, that low, guttural chattering. Not exactly the same, not in the same way it had been that night, surrounding us, closing in, but close enough. Horrifyingly familiar. My blood went cold all over again. I froze, staring at the TV, my heart pounding just like it had back in those woods. The show went on to talk about Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever you want to call it. Creatures sighted in remote forests, known for their vocalizations, including sounds like chattering. They played more recordings. Some of them were deeper, louder, more growling than chattering. But some were just like what I'd heard. That same unsettling, rhythmic, almost words but not words chattering sound. They even played some recordings of wood-knocking sounds, rhythmic thumps against trees, and they mentioned reports of strange cracking sounds, like rocks being broken. I turned the TV off, just like that, clicked the remote and plunged the room into silence. Sat there in the dark for a long time, just thinking, remembering. That night by the creek, the fear, the feeling of being surrounded, the chattering, the thumping, the cracking stones, Bigfoot, Sasquatch, I don't know. I don't believe in monsters, never have. But what else could it have been? What else makes sounds like that? What else would be out there in the middle of nowhere in the dead of night, making those terrifying, unexplainable noises? I don't have answers. To this day, I don't know what happened that night. But I know what I heard. I know what I felt. And I know, with a certainty that chills me to the bone, that something was out there. Something big, something unknown. And whatever it was watching us, listening to us. And it made those sounds I still hear sometimes in the back of my mind when the night is dark and the woods are quiet. And I swear every now and then, especially in the deep quiet of night, I hear a faint chattering, carried on the wind, and the fear comes rushing back like it was yesterday. And I know it's still out there, somewhere in the dark woods, still chattering. Story 14? Okay, so this is still messing with me years later. I don't really talk about it much. People look at you sideways if you do, you know, like you're nuts or something. But this actually happened, every single bit of it. And it's just stuck with me. It was summer, hot, muggy Ohio summer night. The kind where you leave the windows open because you're too cheap to crank the AC all night, even though you know the humidity is going to turn your sheets into a swamp. I was dead asleep, must have been close to midnight, maybe a little later. The air was thick, and I was tossing and turning, probably dreaming some stupid nonsense. Then, bam! This scream just ripped through the quiet. It wasn't like a movie scream, all dramatic and drawn out. It was sharp, high-pitched and cut off real fast, like someone got choked off mid-shriek. It was close, too close. My eyes snapped open, heart pounding. I sat straight up in bed, listening, trying to figure out if I'd dreamt it. But no, it was real. Dead quiet now. But that scream, it just hung in the air. My room was pitch black, except for the little bit of moonlight coming through the window. I could hear my own breathing, loud and shaky. My skin prickled, and I got that awful feeling in the pit of my stomach, like when you're waiting for the roller coaster to drop. I told myself it was just some animal, maybe a cat getting into a fight or a fox, something like that. We lived out on the edge of Oak Haven, a little ways out of town, plenty of woods and fields around. Animals were normal, but this scream, it didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. I swung my legs out of bed and stood up, trying to be quiet. The floorboards creaked under my feet, even though I was trying to tiptoe. I moved to the window and peeked out through the blinds. Nothing, just darkness. Our backyard backed onto a field, and then woods beyond that. The moon was maybe half full, not super bright, but enough to see shapes. Everything was still and silent. Too silent. After that scream, you'd expect to hear something, even crickets or cicadas, but it was just quiet, heavy quiet. I stood there for a few minutes, just staring out into the darkness, trying to see something, anything. Nothing moved, nothing made a sound. Maybe it was just a dream after all, I thought, wishing it was true. Maybe I was just freaking myself out. Trying to calm down, I turned away from the window, figuring I'd go back to bed. That's when I heard it. Scritch, scritch, scritch. It was coming from the wall right outside my bedroom, the wall that faced the side yard. Like something was dragging its claws down the siding of the house, slow, deliberate scratches. Not fast or panicked, just there. Scritch, scritch. Each scratch made my stomach clench tighter. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't an animal. This wasn't a branch scraping in the wind. This was something intentional. Something right outside my window, touching the house. I froze, listening, not even daring to breathe. The scratching stopped for a second, and then I heard it. Footsteps, heavy footsteps, not like someone walking normally, more like thumps, slow, heavy thumps, coming from the side of the house, moving along the gravel path that ran from the front yard to the back. Thump, thump, thump. They were getting closer to my window. Terror went cold and sharp through me. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my ears. I backed away from the window slowly, moving back towards my bedroom door, keeping my eyes glued to the wall. Each thump outside felt like a punch to my gut. Whatever was making those sounds was big, and it was right outside. The footsteps stopped right outside my window, right outside the wall where I'd heard the scratching. Silence again. But this wasn't the heavy quiet from before. This was charged quiet, like holding your breath underwater, waiting for something to break. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to get out of my room. I had to tell my dad. Dad would know what to do. He was always calm, always practical. He'd tell me it was just raccoons or something stupid, and he'd go outside and chase them away, and everything would be okay. That's what I needed to happen. I tiptoed to my door and opened it as quietly as I could, just a crack, and peeked out. The hallway was dark. The only light was a dim glow from the nightlight in the bathroom at the end of the hall. No sounds from downstairs. Everything was still and dark inside the house too. I slipped out of my room and hurried down the hallway to my parents' bedroom. Their door was closed. I knocked softly, then a little louder when they didn't answer right away. "Dad," I whispered, my voice cracking. "Dad, wake up!" After a second, I heard him stir. The door creaked open, and he was standing there in the doorway, blinking sleepily. He was just in his boxers and a t-shirt, hair messed up, looking confused. "Daniel, what's wrong? What time is it?" he mumbled, rubbing his eyes. "Dad, there's something outside," I whispered, my voice trembling. I heard a scream, and then scratching and footsteps. He frowned, still half asleep. "Footsteps? What are you talking about? You probably just had a bad dream." "No, Dad, I didn't. I heard it. It was real. Something's outside." I was almost pleading with him now. I could feel the fear rising in my chest, pushing the words out faster. Heavy footsteps, like something big, and scratching on the wall. "Please, Dad, you have to come look." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. Okay, come on. Let's go see what's going on. Probably just raccoons knocking over the trash cans." He tried to sound reassuring, but I could tell he was a little uneasy too, now that he was properly awake. We went back down the hallway, me leading the way, him following behind, still yawning and stretching. We got to the kitchen, and it was even darker in there than the hallway. The only light was coming from the moon, filtering in through the windows, casting long, spooky shadows across the counters and the table. "Where did you hear these sounds from?" he asked, his voice still low, but more alert now. "My bedroom, the side of the house, and then it moved around to the back, I think." He nodded slowly, moving towards the big window above the sink, the one that looked out into the backyard. "All right, let's take a look. Stay behind me." He reached for the light switch by the door, then hesitated. Actually, no, don't turn on the lights. We'll just look from here first, see if we can see anything in the dark. That made me even more nervous. If he was worried about turning on the lights, it meant he wasn't totally dismissing me anymore. It meant he was taking it seriously. He moved slowly to the window, and I stayed right behind him, peering over his shoulder. The backyard was still dark, but the moonlight was a little brighter on this side of the house. We could see the outline of the shed at the back of the yard, the swing set swaying gently in the slight breeze. Nothing else, just shadows and quiet. "See?" he said, turning back to me, trying to force a smile. "Nothing out there, probably just your imagination running wild." I wanted to believe him. I really did, but I knew what I'd heard, and I knew it wasn't my imagination. "But the scream, Dad," he sighed again, heading for the kitchen table. All right, let's just take a look around outside, just to be sure. I'm going to grab a cigarette, calm my nerves." He went to the drawer and pulled out a pack of cigarettes and a lighter, shaking one out and lighting it, taking a long drag. He sat down at the kitchen table facing the window and leaned back in his chair, smoke curling up around his head. He looked tired and still a little grumpy, but I could see a flicker of something else in his eyes, a hint of worry maybe. He was staring out the window, his gaze fixed on the backyard, smoking his cigarette, lost in thought. I stood there next to him, still peering out the window, feeling a little bit calmer now that he was here, even though the fear was still buzzing under my skin. We were both silent, just looking out into the darkness, the only sound the faint crackling of his cigarette and the quiet hum of the refrigerator. Then he stiffened. His hand froze halfway to his mouth, cigarette smoke hanging in the air. His eyes widened, staring at something behind me. He went completely still, like he'd turned to stone. "Dad?" I whispered, turning to look at him. "What is it?" He didn't answer. His eyes were locked on something behind me, fixed with a look of pure, unadulterated terror. His face had gone pale, and his mouth was slightly open, like he was trying to say something but couldn't get the words out. The cigarette slipped from his numb fingers and fell to the floor, burning a tiny hole in the linoleum. He didn't even notice. I followed his gaze, turning around slowly, my heart hammering in my chest again. I looked at the window above the sink, the big window we'd been just looking out of, the one that looked into the backyard. And there it was, in the faint moonlight filtering through the window, silhouetted against the darker shadows of the backyard, was something enormous. A dark, massive shape, pressed right up against the window, filling almost the entire frame. It was just a silhouette, a black outline against the slightly lighter darkness, but it was huge, taller than the window, wider than the window, too big to be a person, too big to be any animal I'd ever imagined. It was just there. A dark, solid mass, blocking out the light, staring directly into the kitchen, and I knew, with a certainty that went bone deep, that it was staring directly at us. At me and my dad sitting at the kitchen table. I couldn't make out any details, just the massive shape. No eyes, no face, no features, just blackness, impenetrable, solid, terrifying blackness. It was like looking into a void. My breath hitched in my throat. My blood ran cold. I felt like I was going to faint. My mind just blanked. I couldn't process what I was seeing. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. My dad made a sound, not a scream, not a shout, just a strangled, choked gasp. He stumbled backwards in his chair, pushing away from the table, his eyes wide and glazed with pure primal fear. He tripped over his own feet and crashed backwards onto the kitchen floor, landing with a loud thud. I didn't even react. I couldn't take my eyes off the window, off the silhouette. It was still there, unmoving, silent, just watching, just being. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. Just gone. 1 second, it was filling the window, looming and terrifying. The next second, the window was empty. Just the dark backyard, the swaying swing set, the shadows of the trees. Nothing. I blinked, trying to clear my vision, thinking maybe I was hallucinating, maybe it was some kind of trick of the light, some shadow playing games with my eyes. But no, it was gone. Completely, utterly gone. I stood there, frozen, staring at the empty window, my body shaking, my teeth chattering. My dad was still on the floor behind me, making low, whimpering sounds, trying to scramble back to his feet. I finally managed to turn away from the window, slowly, carefully, like it might still be there, hiding just out of sight, waiting to jump out at me. My dad was struggling to stand up, leaning against the kitchen cabinets, his face still ashen. He was breathing hard, ragged gasps, his eyes darting around the room like he expected it to reappear inside the house. Did you see that? He stammered, his voice hoarse and trembling. Did you see that thing? I nodded slowly, unable to speak. My throat was too tight, my voice trapped. Tears were starting to well up in my eyes, blurring my vision. He pushed himself away from the cabinets, swaying slightly, still shaking. He took a shaky step towards the window, then stopped, hesitant. He reached out a trembling hand and turned on the kitchen light. The sudden brightness felt harsh, almost painful after the darkness. The kitchen flooded with yellow light, chasing away the shadows. We both stared at the window, now just a normal kitchen window, looking out into a normal, empty backyard. Nothing there. Nothing at all. He took a step closer to the window, then another, cautiously peering out into the yard. He scanned the whole backyard, his eyes searching, desperate to see something, anything, but there was nothing. Just the grass, the shed, the trees, normal, ordinary. He turned back to me, his face a mix of disbelief and terror. What? What was that? He whispered, his voice barely audible. What in God's name was that thing? I shook my head again, tears streaming down my face now. I don't know, I choked out, my voice trembling. I don't know, Dad. I don't know. We stood there for a long time, just staring at each other, both of us completely shaken, completely terrified. The kitchen light hummed overhead, too bright, too normal. It didn't make anything better. It didn't make the fear go away, because we both knew what we had seen. We had both seen it. That massive dark silhouette at the window, staring into our kitchen. We never talked about it much after that night. Not really. We tried to pretend it didn't happen, tried to go back to normal, but normal was gone. Something had shifted that night, something had broken. The safe feeling of home, of being secure, it was just gone. I still live in this house. Dad passed away a few years ago. Sometimes late at night when the house is quiet, I find myself staring out the kitchen window, looking into the darkness, waiting, wondering. I never saw anything like it again, but I know what I saw, and I know that whatever it was, whatever that massive dark thing was at our window that night, it was real, and it was watching us, and I still have no idea what it wanted. Story 15. So, naturally, we got curious. Ryan and I, we'd been reading up on stuff happening around the park, especially around Area 61. Just online stuff, forums, local news blurbs from years ago, even some old police reports we dug up. Nothing concrete, mostly just vague sightings, weird sounds, people feeling uneasy. But enough little breadcrumbs to make us want to check it out for ourselves. We're not reckless, or at least we try not to be. We figured a night hike, a little exploration, couldn't hurt. We brought a camera, a thermal imager, some basic stuff, nothing crazy. Just wanted to see if we could pick up anything unusual, disprove the rumors, or maybe actually find something. We went on a Saturday night. Figured if anything was going to happen, Saturday night was as good a night as any. We parked at the main entrance, even though it was closed for the night, and walked in. It was already dark, past dusk for sure. The air was cold, real cold. the kind that gets right into your lungs and makes you cough. The trees were mostly bare, leaves all crunchy on the ground, just black shapes against the fading light. Even the usual night sounds seemed muted. No crickets chirping, no owls hooting, just quiet. Too quiet. As we walked further in, towards where we thought Area 61 was, the quiet got heavier, like a blanket being thrown over everything. We were using our headlamps, the beams cutting through the dark, making everything outside the light seem even blacker. We were talking, mostly about the stuff we'd read, trying to psych ourselves up, or maybe calm ourselves down, I don't know. Just normal guy stuff, joking around, pretending we weren't actually a little nervous. And then that feeling started. You know the one? Like you're being watched. It wasn't just in my head either. Ryan stopped walking, and I stopped too. We just stood there in the beam of our headlamps, looking around at the trees. "You feel that?" Ryan whispered, and his voice sounded shaky, even to my own ears. I nodded, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't like someone was actually there right next to us, but it was like eyes. Like something was out there in the darkness, beyond the reach of our lights, watching us. Heavy, intense watching. We kept going anyway, stupid maybe. But we'd come this far, and we wanted to at least get to Area 61, see what it was like. We walked slower now, more carefully, our headlamps sweeping back and forth, trying to pierce the darkness. The trees got thicker, the woods closed in around us. It was getting colder too, if that was even possible, and the silence was just deafening. Except for our own footsteps crunching on the leaves and our breathing, there was absolutely nothing. No wind, no animals, nothing. Then it happened. Just like that, out of nowhere, the silence shattered. A scream, not human. God, not human. High-pitched, piercing, like metal scraping on metal, but alive. It echoed through the trees, bouncing back and forth, making it impossible to tell where it came from, just everywhere at once. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before in my life. It wasn't an animal scream, not like a fox or a coyote or anything normal. This was wrong, deeply wrong. It cut right through you, made your blood run cold. Ryan and I froze solid, headlamps locked straight ahead, breathing stopped in our throats. The scream died away, leaving that heavy silence behind, but now it was different silence. Heavy, yes, but now it was also charged. Like the air itself was vibrating, waiting for something else to happen. My heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my chest, my ears, everywhere. Then came the whooping. Lower this time, not high-pitched like the scream, but still alien. Like something trying to imitate a human sound, but failing horribly. Whoop, whoop, whoop. It started slow, then got faster, closer. It was moving through the woods. We could hear its shifting position, coming from different directions, circling us maybe. I don't know, my brain was just starting to freak out. Ryan grabbed my arm, his hand like ice digging in hard. He was staring into the trees, eyes wide, pupils blown out in the beam of his headlamp. The whooping sounds got louder, faster, more frantic. They were definitely closer now, much closer. And then the thuds started. Heavy, booming thuds, like something big, impossibly big, was moving through the woods, smashing into the ground with each step. Thump, thump, thump. Each thud seemed to shake the ground beneath our feet. You could feel it in your bones. These weren't footsteps, not like human footsteps. These were heavy, powerful impacts, like something huge walking on two legs. And then the growl. That's what broke me. That's when pure, unadulterated terror took over. It wasn't just a growl like a dog or a bear. It was deep, guttural, rumbling from somewhere deep in the chest. But it wasn't a chest we knew. It was low, resonant, like the sound of the earth itself being angry. It vibrated through the air, even deeper and more terrifying than the thuds. It wasn't just a sound, it was a presence. It felt like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere at the same time, wrapping around us, enclosing us. That growl, combined with the whooping and the thuds, all happening at once, all around us in the pitch-black woods. It just overloaded my brain. Logic went out the window. Rational thought just evaporated. All that was left was pure, primal fear. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run. Run now. Run for your life. And that's what we did. We didn't even look at each other. We just turned and bolted. Back the way we came, back towards the parking lot, back towards any kind of light, any kind of safety. We ran blindly, stumbling over roots, branches whipping at our faces, leaves flying up from our feet. We didn't even turn off our headlamps, just ran, the beams bouncing wildly ahead of us, lighting up trees for a split second, then plunging us back into darkness. I don't know how long we ran. Felt like forever. My lungs were burning, my legs were aching, my heart was trying to beat its way out of my chest. I could hear Ryan behind me, his breathing ragged and gasping, just as terrified as I was. We didn't say a word, didn't even look back. Just ran, fueled by pure adrenaline and terror. The sounds from the woods, they didn't follow us, not exactly, but they didn't stop either. We could still hear the whooping, fainter now, but still there. And the growls, those low, monstrous growls, they seemed to linger in the air, even as we ran further away. We burst out of the trees and into the parking lot like we were being shot out of a cannon. My car was right there, thank God. We scrambled inside, fumbling with the keys, slamming the doors shut and locking them even before I got the engine started. I jammed the key into the ignition, twisted it, the engine roared to life. I threw the car into reverse, tires spitting gravel, and just hammered it out of there, back onto the main road, away from the park, away from those woods.